Imagine standing before a stone so enormous that even modern machines seem insignificant beside it. A block so massive that moving it would require cranes, trucks, engineers, and months of planning. Now imagine finding that stone buried inside a structure built thousands of years ago by people who supposedly had none of those things. No engines, no steel cranes, no electric power, no modern roads. And yet somehow, the stone is there, precisely cut, precisely placed, locked into a monument that has survived earthquakes, wars, empires, and centuries of abandonment. For generations, we have been told that ancient civilizations built their greatest monuments with simple tools, enormous manpower, and enough time. Perhaps that is true. But then another question appears. If the explanation is so simple, why do some of these achievements remain so difficult to reproduce? And what happens when we discover evidence that ancient craftsmen understood materials, mathematics, engineering, and astronomy with a sophistication we never expected? Buried beneath the ruins of the ancient world is a story that may be stranger than any legend. Not necessarily a story about visitors from another planet, not necessarily a lost super-civilization, but a story about human beings and knowledge that may have disappeared so completely that today we can barely recognize what we are looking at. In the Middle East, there is a place where this mystery begins with stone. Its name is Baalbek. Today, the ruins rise from the landscape of modern Lebanon, massive remnants of an ancient sanctuary that became one of the most extraordinary architectural sites left behind by the Roman world. Earthquakes once shook the region with terrifying force. Walls cracked. Buildings collapsed. Roads and settlements were destroyed. Yet portions of Baalbek continued to stand. And among those surviving ruins is the Temple of Jupiter. The temple was once supported by enormous columns, each rising roughly 70 feet above the ground. Only 6 remain today, but even these surviving pillars are enough to reveal the scale of the original structure. They are not delicate monuments. They are gigantic assemblies of stone, engineered to carry enormous loads and endure the forces of time. But the columns are not even the most mysterious part. Look beneath them. At the foundation are enormous limestone blocks, some estimated to weigh hundreds of tons. 3 particularly famous stones, known as the Trilithon, are among the largest stones ever incorporated into an ancient monumental structure. Each weighs hundreds of tons. And then there is the quarry. Only a short distance from the sanctuary, ancient builders extracted enormous blocks of limestone from the earth. One of the most famous is known as the Stone of the South, or Hajar al-Hibla. It was never completely separated from the bedrock, leaving behind a frozen moment in the construction process. The sheer size of the stone forces an uncomfortable question. Why would anyone even attempt this? Imagine the sequence. First, the stone had to be selected. Then it had to be cut from the living rock. Then shaped. Then transported, then lifted, then positioned with enough accuracy that the entire structure would remain stable. Every stage creates another engineering problem. A modern construction crew could solve many of these problems with heavy machinery. Cranes could lift the material. Trucks could transport it. Hydraulic systems could move and position it. Surveying equipment could measure every angle and elevation. But ancient builders did not have those machines. They had wood, rope, stone, metal tools, manpower, mathematics, and time. That does not make their achievement impossible. It makes it remarkable. And this distinction matters. For centuries, mysterious ancient monuments have attracted explanations involving forgotten super technologies, unknown civilizations, and even extraterrestrial visitors. The temptation is understandable. When something looks impossible, the mind searches for an extraordinary answer. But archaeology often tells a more complicated story. Ancient people did not need modern technology to accomplish extraordinary things. They needed knowledge. Knowledge of friction, knowledge of leverage, knowledge of ramps and slopes, knowledge of geometry, knowledge of stone, and perhaps most importantly, knowledge accumulated across generations. A single builder may not have understood every principle involved, but an entire tradition of craftsmen could preserve practical knowledge without ever writing it down in a textbook. A technique could pass from master to apprentice. A measurement could become a tradition. A construction method could be remembered through practice. And once that chain was broken, the knowledge could disappear. This may be one of the most important clues to understanding ancient mysteries. Technology is not always a machine. Sometimes technology is a method. Sometimes it is a material recipe. Sometimes it is a construction technique so familiar to one civilization that nobody thought it was necessary to explain. And when that civilization disappeared, the technique disappeared with it. But Baalbek raises another problem. The stones are not simply large. They are positioned within a sophisticated architectural system. The builders had to understand how enormous masses behaved under pressure. They had to control surfaces, angles, joints, and foundations. They had to make decisions that would remain stable for centuries. And they succeeded. The ruins standing before us are not evidence that ancient people had technology identical to ours. They are evidence that the word technology itself may be too narrow when we use it to describe the ancient world. We tend to measure technological progress by comparing ancient objects with modern ones. No engine? Primitive. No electricity? Primitive. No computer? Primitive. But what if that is the wrong measurement? What if a civilization can possess extraordinary engineering knowledge without ever developing the technologies that dominate our own age? A Roman engineer did not need a diesel engine to understand weight. An Egyptian craftsman did not need a computer to understand symmetry. An ancient glassmaker did not need a microscope to discover that adding particular substances could change the behavior of glass. And that brings us to an object far smaller than the stones of Baalbek. An object that can fit inside your hands. A cup. The Lycurgus cup. At first glance, it looks like a beautiful ancient Roman vessel. But place light behind it, and something astonishing happens. Its color changes. Under one lighting condition, it appears green. Under another, it becomes a deep reddish color. For centuries, nobody fully understood why. Modern analysis revealed something extraordinary hidden within the glass itself. Tiny particles of gold and silver had been incorporated into the material, not visible to the naked eye, not arranged like decorations, embedded within the glass at microscopic scales. Today, we have scientific instruments capable of studying materials at extraordinary levels of detail. We can deliberately manipulate particles and engineer materials with precise properties. But the ancient craftsman who created the cup did not possess our scientific vocabulary. There was no modern nanotechnology laboratory. There was no electron microscope. And yet the result existed. That does not prove that ancient Romans understood nanotechnology in the modern sense. It does prove something more interesting. They could achieve sophisticated material effects without possessing the theoretical framework we associate with those effects today. Perhaps they learned through experimentation. Perhaps the knowledge was inherited. Perhaps generations of craftsmen refined the process until they knew exactly what combination produced the desired result. And then, eventually, the technique disappeared. That possibility is far more unsettling than the idea of aliens, because it means the ancient world may have contained countless forms of practical knowledge that were never fully recorded. Knowledge can vanish. A city can burn. A workshop can collapse. A master can die without revealing every secret. An empire can fall. Trade routes can disappear. Languages can become unreadable. And suddenly, Something that was once ordinary becomes a mystery thousands of years later. Baalbek shows us the scale of ancient engineering. The Lycurgus cup shows us the sophistication of ancient materials. And together, they force us to reconsider a simple assumption. Perhaps the ancient world was not technologically primitive. Perhaps it was technologically different. And if that is true, then the real mystery is not how ancient people could possibly have built these things. The real mystery is how much they knew that never survived. Because somewhere beneath the deserts, beneath ruined cities, beneath collapsed temples, and beneath layers of soil, there may still be evidence waiting to tell us what ancient civilizations were truly capable of. And the deeper we look, the stranger the evidence becomes. The deeper archaeologists look into Baalbek, the less ordinary the stones begin to seem. From a distance, the ruins appear to be another magnificent monument left behind by the Roman world. Massive columns, broken temples, weathered walls, and fragments scattered across the landscape. But walk closer, and the scale changes completely. What first looks like architecture begins to resemble a landscape of stone giants. The most famous example is the Trilithon, 3 enormous limestone blocks incorporated into the platform of the Temple of Jupiter. Each block weighs hundreds of tons. They are not merely sitting somewhere near the monument. They were transported, positioned, and integrated into a carefully engineered foundation. And that creates a problem that has fascinated researchers for generations. How? The answer is not as simple as saying, thousands of workers pulled them. Human beings are extraordinarily strong when they work together. Ancient societies could organize enormous labor forces. They could build roads, ramps, sledges, and temporary structures. They could spend years preparing a single monument. But moving an object weighing several hundred tons is not simply a matter of adding more people. The stone must first be separated from the quarry. That means cutting around it without destroying it. Then the block has to be lifted or raised enough to place a transportation system beneath it. If wooden sledges are used, the surface must be prepared. If ropes are used, they must be strong enough to withstand enormous tension. If ramps are involved, the slope has to be carefully controlled. And every movement must be coordinated. A single mistake could destroy the block, injure workers, or damage the structure being built. Ancient engineers therefore had to think about something we rarely associate with the ancient world: logistics. They had to know not only how to build, but how to move. That distinction is crucial. A monument is the final product. The real technology is hidden in everything that happened before the monument existed. The quarry, the roads, the workers, the ropes, the sledges, the ramps, the measurements, the food, the water, the organization, the timing, the entire system. And Baalbek represents an enormous logistical operation. About 3/4 of a mile from the sanctuary lies the ancient quarry where some of the site's largest stones were extracted. Among them is the enormous block known as the Stone of the South. It remained unfinished, still attached to the bedrock. Its dimensions are extraordinary. But what makes it especially valuable to archaeologists is that it gives us something the completed monument cannot: a glimpse into the process. The stone shows us where the builders stopped. Perhaps the project changed. Perhaps the stone was judged unsuitable. Perhaps the construction plan changed. Perhaps the builders simply abandoned the task. Whatever happened, the unfinished block is almost like an ancient photograph. It freezes the technology of construction at a particular moment. And then, in modern times, archaeologists discovered another enormous block in the quarry, estimated at more than 1,000 tons. Again, the question returns: why create something this large? And more importantly, why leave it unfinished? The easiest response is to assume that the ancient builders were attempting something extraordinary. But that still leaves the central mystery unresolved. How were they going to move it? There is no surviving Roman manual explaining exactly how the largest Baalbek stones were transported. There is no ancient blueprint showing the complete system. Instead, researchers have to reconstruct the process from physical evidence, comparative engineering, ancient texts, and experiments. This is one of archaeology's greatest challenges. We are looking at the result without having the instruction manual. Imagine finding a modern skyscraper thousands of years from now, but every crane, truck, elevator, computer, and construction plan had disappeared. Future archaeologists might understand that humans built it. They might understand basic physics. They might even find fragments of steel. But they would still struggle to reconstruct the entire process. That is essentially the problem with many ancient monuments. The technology may have existed as a collection of practical techniques rather than a written scientific theory. Ancient engineers may not have described their work using equations. They may simply have known what worked. Pull here. Raise this. Support that. Change the angle. Add another rope. Wet the surface. Move slowly. Repeat. This kind of knowledge can be incredibly sophisticated, even when it leaves almost no written record. There is another important detail about Baalbek. The enormous stones are not perfectly mysterious simply because they are enormous. Ancient civilizations around the world moved massive objects. The Egyptians transported gigantic blocks for pyramids and temples. The people of Easter Island moved enormous statues. Megalithic builders in Europe transported stones across significant distances. The Inca moved enormous stones through difficult mountain landscapes. So Baalbek should not be isolated from the wider history of ancient engineering. Instead, it should be seen as one piece of a much larger puzzle. Ancient civilizations repeatedly discovered ways to manipulate massive quantities of stone. And sometimes they did it at a scale that still shocks us. But there is another reason Baalbek became associated with mysterious theories. Some researchers and alternative history enthusiasts have suggested that the platform is far older than the Roman structures built above it. Others have proposed that earlier civilizations may have constructed parts of the foundations, and that later cultures simply reused them. This possibility is worth examining carefully. Ancient sites were frequently reused. Civilizations rarely built in complete isolation from the past. A later empire could arrive at an existing sacred site, modify it, expand it, and build its own monument over older foundations. The result can become a layered archaeological record where different periods overlap. Baalbek contains evidence of Roman construction, but that does not automatically mean every stone visible today was quarried and placed during the same period. This is why archaeology depends so heavily on dating, stratigraphy, inscriptions, tool marks, construction styles, and context. Without that evidence, it becomes easy to turn a fascinating question into a dramatic story. And the most dramatic story is often not the most accurate one. There is no credible evidence that extraterrestrial beings built Baalbek. There is no proven ancient machine capable of lifting hundreds of tons with technology beyond what we understand. But there is something we can say with confidence. The people who built and modified this monumental complex possessed extraordinary organizational and engineering abilities. They understood how to work with stone at enormous scales. They knew how to create stable foundations. They could transport heavy materials. And they were willing to invest tremendous resources into architecture whose purpose was religious, political, and cultural. That alone is extraordinary. And perhaps the most important lesson is that we should not underestimate ancient people simply because their machines looked different from ours. A civilization does not need engines to become technically sophisticated. It needs knowledge, and knowledge can survive without machines. Sometimes it survives in the hands of craftsmen, sometimes in traditions, sometimes in architectural proportions, sometimes in a single surviving object, and sometimes it disappears entirely. Baalbek therefore leaves us with a strange paradox. The stones are still here. The temples are still here. The quarry is still here. The evidence of the work is visible. But the complete knowledge required to reproduce the process in exactly the same way may be gone. And that is where the mystery becomes larger than Baalbek. Because if one ancient civilization could master enormous stone construction, what else did others understand? What did Egyptian craftsmen know about materials? What did Mesopotamian engineers know about mathematics? What did Indian scholars know about medicine and astronomy? What did ancient Greek inventors understand about mechanical systems? And how many of their techniques vanished when their societies changed? The answer may be hidden in objects that seem impossible only because we have forgotten the context in which they were created. One such object is not a giant stone. It is not a temple. It is not a machine. It is a box of granite hidden beneath the ground. And inside the ancient Egyptian necropolis of Saqqara, archaeologists encountered something that would raise an entirely different question. If ancient builders could move enormous stones above the ground, could they also shape them with a precision that still challenges us today? The answer begins beneath the sands of Egypt. Beneath the ancient landscape of Saqqara, Egypt, the mystery changes completely. At Baalbek, the question was how human beings could move stones of almost unimaginable weight. Here, the question becomes something even more precise. How did ancient craftsmen shape stone with such extraordinary accuracy? Not a simple wall, not a rough monument, but enormous containers carved from single blocks of granite, with surfaces so smooth and symmetrical that they appear almost manufactured. The place is known as the Serapeum of Saqqara. Hidden beneath the desert near the famous Step Pyramid of Djoser, the Serapeum is a vast underground complex of tunnels, chambers, passages, and burial spaces. It was associated with the sacred Apis bulls, animals that held enormous religious significance in ancient Egypt. But the objects that immediately capture the imagination are the massive stone sarcophagi. These are not ordinary coffins. They are enormous. Some weigh many tens of tons, with individual examples reaching weights that would challenge modern lifting equipment. They were carved from hard stones such as granite and placed inside underground chambers. And then comes the detail that makes the story so fascinating. Their surfaces are remarkably smooth. Their corners are sharply defined. Their proportions are carefully controlled. And some of the interiors appear to have been finished to an extraordinary level of precision. The ancient Egyptians had copper tools, stone tools, abrasive materials, and enormous amounts of labor. They did not have modern steel cutting machines. They did not have electric grinders. They did not have computer-controlled milling equipment. So how did they do it? The answer begins with something surprisingly simple: abrasives. Stone itself can be difficult to cut with a softer metal tool. But if you introduce an abrasive material, the situation changes. A copper tool does not necessarily have to slice directly through granite. Instead, the abrasive particles can do much of the cutting. Sand, quartz-rich material, or other hard particles can act like countless tiny cutting edges. The tool provides pressure and movement. The abrasive does the grinding. Slowly, very slowly. Over time, material disappears. This process is not magic, but scale changes everything. Imagine trying to create a perfectly straight surface on a massive granite box using hand-operated tools and abrasive material. Then imagine doing it again, and again. Every surface has to meet the next surface. The corners have to remain aligned. The lid must fit. The interior must be large enough for its intended purpose. The final object has to survive transportation through tunnels and chambers. That is not a casual craft project. It is industrial-scale stoneworking. And this is where the Serapeum becomes one of the most intriguing places in ancient Egypt, because these objects force us to separate two ideas that are often confused. The first is whether ancient Egyptians had technology. Of course they did. The second is whether they had technology identical to ours. They clearly did not. Their technological system was based on different materials, different tools, different sources of energy, and different forms of organization. But different does not mean primitive. A modern engineer might solve a problem with electricity and machinery. An ancient engineer might solve the same problem with abrasive stone, leverage, geometry, and thousands of hours of skilled labor. The final result can still be impressive. And sometimes, the ancient method can be more difficult to reconstruct than the modern one, because modern technology leaves an enormous trail. We have manuals, machine designs, material specifications, factories, power systems, digital records. Ancient technology often leaves only the finished object. The instruction manual is gone. The workshop is gone. The craftsman is gone. And that makes the artifact appear mysterious. There is another problem. Some of the most spectacular claims about ancient stoneworking come from measurements and experiments that are still debated. People sometimes point to extremely straight surfaces or unusual tool marks and argue that ancient Egyptians must have used advanced machines. Others suggest lost civilizations, unknown technologies, or even tools that resemble modern cutting equipment. But there is a crucial difference between saying, "We do not fully understand every step," and saying, "Therefore, an advanced civilization must have built it." The first statement is reasonable. The second requires evidence. And archaeology is built around that distinction. We should not underestimate ancient craftsmen, but we should not invent technologies for them either. The Serapeum gives us enough evidence to tell a remarkable story without adding anything supernatural. Ancient Egyptians were capable of quarrying enormous stones. They could transport heavy materials. They could organize specialized labor. They could use abrasives and hard stone tools to shape difficult materials. And they could repeat complex processes with enough consistency to produce objects that still survive thousands of years later. But there is another question. Why did they need such enormous sarcophagi in the first place? The answer leads into the religious world of ancient Egypt. The Apis bull was not simply an animal. It was considered sacred and connected with the god Ptah. When an Apis bull died, its burial became an important religious event. The Serapeum became a monumental underground burial complex. This meant that the enormous stone containers were not random experiments in engineering. They had a purpose. They belonged to a religious system where the physical treatment of sacred animals carried enormous symbolic importance. And once we understand that context, the monument becomes less mysterious in one sense, but more fascinating in another, because it tells us that ancient engineering was not always driven by practical necessity. Sometimes civilizations used their greatest technical abilities for religion, for identity, for power, for the dead, and for ideas about the universe. The same pattern appears again and again throughout history. People will spend decades constructing a cathedral, generations building a temple, centuries maintaining a sacred road. An entire civilization can dedicate extraordinary resources to something that produces no obvious economic return. To us, that can seem irrational. To them, it may have been essential. The Serapeum also reveals something about ancient Egyptian organization. A project of this size required more than individual genius. It required supply chains, workers, stone cutters, transporters, surveyors, religious officials, administrators, food, water, tools, and an authority capable of keeping the entire system functioning. The finished sarcophagus is therefore only the visible end of an enormous hidden machine. Not a machine made of gears, a machine made of people. thousands of decisions, thousands of movements, thousands of repeated actions. And that may be one of the most overlooked technologies of the ancient world: organization itself. When we see a massive ancient monument, we often imagine one brilliant architect standing in the desert, pointing toward a stone. But monumental construction was almost certainly a collective achievement. One person may have designed the geometry. Another may have selected the stone. Another may have supervised the quarry. Another may have developed the finishing technique. Another may have organized transportation. Another may have measured the final position. The monument was the product of an entire society. And once that society disappeared, the system disappeared with it. This is why ancient technology can feel like a lost language. We can see the letters. We can see the words. But sometimes we no longer know exactly how every sentence was constructed. And yet Saqqara is only one part of the story. Because ancient Egypt produced another object that challenges our assumptions about what ancient craftsmen understood. It is smaller, more delicate, and far more colorful. Unlike the granite sarcophagi, it does not appear to contain anything extraordinary, until the light changes. Then the entire object seems to transform. Its color shifts before your eyes. And hidden inside the glass are particles so tiny that they could not be seen by the ancient craftsmen who placed them there. An object created nearly 2,000 years ago would eventually become one of the most famous examples of ancient material science: the Lycurgus cup. And when modern scientists finally examined what was happening inside that glass, they discovered something that sounded almost impossible. The ancient world had created a material with properties that resemble a primitive form of nanotechnology. The mystery was no longer about moving stone. It was about controlling matter itself. And that discovery would take us from the underground chambers of Egypt to the microscopic world hidden inside an ancient cup. The most unsettling ancient technologies are not always the largest. Sometimes they fit inside your hands. Sometimes they look ordinary. And sometimes the evidence of extraordinary knowledge is hidden inside the material itself, invisible until modern science knows where to look. The Lycurgus cup is one of those objects. At first glance, it appears to be a beautiful Roman drinking vessel. It dates from around the 4th century of the Common Era and depicts the mythological story of King Lycurgus. The craftsmanship is impressive, but nothing about the cup immediately suggests that it belongs in a discussion about advanced technology. Then light passes through it. The cup changes color. Under reflected light, it can appear greenish. Under transmitted light, it can become a deep reddish or wine-like color. It looks almost alive. For generations, the effect was simply part of the mystery surrounding the object. Ancient craftsmen had somehow created a glass vessel that behaved in a way that seemed remarkably sophisticated. Modern science eventually provided an explanation. But the explanation did not make the cup less extraordinary. It made it stranger. Researchers discovered that the glass contains tiny particles of gold and silver. These particles are incredibly small. They are measured on the nanoscale. The ancient craftsmen obviously did not use the term nanoparticle. They had no electron microscope to show them what was happening inside the glass. They could not observe individual particles at the scale modern scientists can. And yet those particles were there. The composition of the material caused the glass to interact with light in a remarkable way. This phenomenon is associated with the optical behavior of tiny metallic particles embedded within the glass. To a modern scientist, the explanation is fascinating. To an ancient craftsman, it may simply have been a recipe. Add this. Heat it to this condition. Cool it this way. Use this amount. Repeat. The person who created the cup may never have understood the physics behind the effect, but they may have understood how to reproduce it. And that distinction changes the way we think about ancient knowledge. Science and technology are related, but they are not identical. A person can use a technology without understanding the theoretical principles behind it. For thousands of years, humans used fermentation without knowing about microorganisms. They navigated using the stars without understanding modern astrophysics. They built arches without writing equations about structural mechanics. They created pigments without understanding molecular chemistry. And they could manipulate materials through trial, error, observation, and tradition. The Lycurgus cup may represent exactly this kind of knowledge. But there is an important question. Was the color-changing effect intentional? The answer is not absolutely certain in every detail. The presence of gold and silver nanoparticles explains the optical effect, but it does not automatically tell us exactly why the craftsman added those materials. The effect could have been deliberately engineered. It could also have emerged from a sophisticated recipe whose full purpose was understood only through practical experience. Either way, the result is extraordinary. And this brings us back to the larger mystery. How many ancient technologies were created through knowledge that was never written down? Imagine a workshop in Roman times. A master glassmaker has spent decades learning the behavior of different materials. He knows which minerals affect the color of glass. He knows how mixtures behave when heated. He knows which ingredients produce a clear surface and which produce a particular shade. He may not understand atoms. He may not understand electromagnetic radiation. He may not know the scientific explanation for what happens. But he knows the process. That practical knowledge can become a closely guarded secret, a craft tradition, a family technique, a workshop specialty. And if that workshop disappears, the knowledge disappears with it. The object remains. The method does not. Thousands of years later, archaeologists discover the object and ask the same question we are asking now. How did they do it? This pattern appears throughout the ancient world. At Baalbek, we see enormous stones. At Saqqara, we see precision stoneworking. In the Lycurgus cup, we see sophisticated optical properties. Different civilizations, different materials, different problems. But the same fundamental mystery. Ancient people were capable of achieving results that modern observers sometimes associate only with advanced technology. That does not mean they possessed modern machines. It means our definition of technological sophistication needs to become more flexible. Consider metallurgy. Ancient civilizations learned to manipulate copper, bronze, iron, gold, silver, and other materials. They discovered alloys. They learned how heat changed metal. They learned how cooling affected strength. Some of these discoveries required generations of experimentation. Today, we can explain these processes scientifically. An ancient craftsman could achieve similar results through experience. The same is true for glass. The Lycurgus cup demonstrates that ancient artisans could control the composition of glass with remarkable precision. But there is another object that pushes this idea even further. The Antikythera mechanism. Unlike the Lycurgus cup, this object was not primarily decorative. It was mechanical. Gears, dials, indicators, astronomical calculations. A device recovered from a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera would eventually become known as one of the most remarkable technological artifacts from antiquity. For years, researchers struggled to understand what they were looking at. The fragments were corroded. The mechanism was incomplete. Many of its components had been crushed or separated. But advanced imaging techniques eventually allowed researchers to reconstruct parts of its internal design. What emerged was astonishing. The mechanism could model astronomical cycles. It could track the movement of celestial bodies and predict events such as eclipses. It represented an extraordinary combination of mathematics, astronomy, mechanical engineering, and craftsmanship. And suddenly, the ancient world looked very different. The question was no longer whether ancient people could create complex technology. The evidence said they could. The question became, How much more existed? How many mechanisms were lost? How many workshops disappeared? How many designs were melted down and recycled? How many inventions were never copied? The Antikythera mechanism is particularly disturbing to our modern assumptions because it appears so isolated. We know of no long continuous tradition of machines exactly like it, surviving into the later medieval world. The knowledge did not necessarily vanish completely, but the specific mechanical tradition represented by the device appears to have become rare or disappeared. And this is how technological history can become misleading. We imagine progress as a straight line. One invention leads to another. Every generation becomes more advanced. Technology moves forward. But real history is not that simple. Civilizations rise. Civilizations collapse. Trade networks break. Wars destroy workshops. Libraries burn. Languages disappear. Political systems change. Skilled craftsmen die. Materials become unavailable. And technologies can be forgotten. Sometimes humanity rediscovers an idea centuries later. Sometimes it never does. That is why an ancient object can appear too advanced without requiring an impossible explanation. It may simply represent a branch of technological development that history abandoned. Imagine a world where a civilization develops an extraordinary mechanical device. Then, the civilization collapses. The machine is destroyed. The craftsmen disappear. The surviving population has different priorities. Agriculture becomes more important. War becomes more important. Political survival becomes more important. The knowledge of precision gears slowly disappears. Centuries later, another civilization independently develops complex clocks. To modern observers, it may appear that the technology was invented for the first time. But perhaps it was not. Perhaps humanity has walked down the same technological roads more than once. Perhaps some roads simply ended. And that possibility brings us back to the Lycurgus Cup. The cup is not evidence of a lost super-civilization. It does not prove ancient people possessed modern nanotechnology. But it does demonstrate something much more credible and much more fascinating. Ancient craftsmen could manipulate materials in ways that modern science can now explain at a microscopic level. They may have achieved extraordinary results without possessing our modern theories. And if one small cup can hide such sophisticated material knowledge, what might be hidden inside thousands of other ancient objects still sitting in museums, tombs, shipwrecks, and archaeological storerooms? Perhaps some mysteries remain unsolved simply because we have not yet learned how to look at them. And sometimes the technology is not hidden in a machine. It is hidden in the stone, hidden in the glass, hidden in the shape, hidden in the process, waiting for someone centuries later to realize that what looked like an ordinary ancient object was actually evidence of knowledge far more sophisticated than anyone expected. There are moments in history when an object seems to appear in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and sometimes in the wrong world entirely. A stone that looks engineered beyond its age. A machine discovered in the ruins of an ancient civilization. A piece of metal that appears impossible for its supposed era. At first, these discoveries seem to whisper one terrifying possibility. Perhaps our understanding of the ancient world is incomplete. But the deeper researchers look, the stranger the questions become. One of the most fascinating examples comes from ancient Egypt, where a small stone object known as the Disk of Sabu was discovered inside the tomb of a high-ranking official who lived thousands of years ago. At first glance, it doesn't look particularly impressive. It is a thin, circular object carved from a fragile stone called schist, with 3 curved lobes extending from its center. But its shape is unusual. Far too unusual. The disc was discovered in the tomb of Sabu at Saqqara, and archaeologists immediately faced a problem. What was this strange object actually made for? It wasn't a normal bowl. It wasn't a simple plate, and it didn't resemble the everyday tools normally found in Egyptian tombs. Its delicate curves would have been extremely difficult to carve using primitive stone and copper tools. Schist is fragile and can break or crumble under pressure. Yet somehow ancient craftsmen produced an object with remarkably precise geometry. That alone is enough to raise eyebrows. But then engineers began looking at the object differently. Instead of seeing it as an ornament, they considered what would happen if the disc were rotated. And suddenly, the mysterious shape began to make sense. The curved sections could potentially function like blades inside a rotating mechanism. Some experimental reconstructions suggested that the disc of Sabu could behave similarly to an impeller, a component used in pumps to move liquids. Imagine that. More than 4,000 years ago, an Egyptian craftsman may have created a stone component capable of producing a powerful vortex. Was it actually used as a pump? We don't know. There is no ancient instruction manual explaining its purpose. No inscription tells us who designed it. No surviving machine has been discovered that clearly fits around the disc. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the artifact so fascinating. Because ancient Egypt was already a civilization deeply dependent on water. The Nile was not simply a river. It was the foundation of Egyptian life. Agriculture, transportation, settlement, and survival all depended on controlling its waters. So perhaps the Disc of Sabu was part of an early experiment in hydraulic technology. Or perhaps it was something completely different. Some researchers have suggested it may have been a ceremonial object. Others believe it could have been a symbolic recreation of an older device originally made from a different material. And then there are the theories that go much further. Some alternative researchers have claimed that the strange disc resembles a component of an advanced machine. Others have even compared its shape to parts of modern technology. But resemblance is not proof. And this is where the mystery becomes more interesting than the sensational theories. Because the real question isn't whether ancient Egyptians secretly possessed futuristic machines. The real question is this: how much technological knowledge have civilizations lost over thousands of years? We often imagine technological progress as a straight line. Stone tools became bronze tools. Bronze became iron. Machines became engines. Engines became computers. But history rarely works that neatly. Civilizations rise and fall. Cities disappear. Libraries burn. Languages die. Skilled craftsmen vanish. Entire traditions can disappear within a few generations. A technique that took centuries to develop could be forgotten almost overnight. And the ancient world contains countless examples of technologies that seem surprisingly sophisticated. Take the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from an ancient shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera, this complicated bronze device contained dozens of gears. It could track astronomical cycles, predict eclipses, follow the movements of celestial bodies, and calculate complex calendar patterns. When researchers first saw it, they struggled to understand what they were looking at. The mechanism seemed almost impossible for its age. For centuries afterward, nothing comparable appeared in Europe. Then came mechanical clocks. And suddenly, more than 1,000 years after the Antikythera mechanism was created, sophisticated geared machinery began appearing again. So where did that knowledge go? Did the technology disappear? Was it preserved somewhere in a workshop whose ruins have never been found? Or was the Antikythera mechanism simply the extraordinary product of a small group of ancient engineers whose knowledge never became widespread? That possibility may be less dramatic than an ancient super-civilization. But in some ways, it is even more unsettling, because it means advanced knowledge can exist without creating an advanced civilization. A brilliant inventor can appear in an otherwise ordinary society. A forgotten engineer can create something centuries ahead of its time. And when that person dies, the knowledge can disappear with them. This possibility takes us back to Baalbek. The enormous stones beneath the ancient sanctuary remain one of the most spectacular engineering puzzles in the ancient world. Some of the blocks weigh hundreds of tons. 3 enormous stones known as the Trilithon form part of the massive platform. And nearby, in the ancient quarry, archaeologists discovered even larger unfinished stones. One of them weighs well over 1,000 tons. The obvious question is not simply how ancient people carved them. It is how they moved them. Modern construction projects rely on cranes, hydraulic systems, heavy transport vehicles, steel cables, engines, and carefully engineered logistics. Ancient builders had none of these things. Yet somehow, enormous stones were transported, positioned, and incorporated into monumental structures. Were ramps involved? Wooden sledges, lubricated surfaces, levers, ropes, and teams of workers? Probably some combination of techniques. But even when modern engineers create theoretical solutions, the sheer scale remains astonishing. And that is where the ancient world repeatedly challenges our assumptions. We tend to underestimate people who lived thousands of years ago because they lacked modern machines. But intelligence does not require electricity. Precision does not require computers. And engineering does not require diesel engines. Human beings are remarkably capable of solving difficult problems with limited resources. The ancient Egyptians proved it. The Greeks proved it. The builders of Mesopotamia proved it. The civilizations of the Indus Valley proved it. And cultures across the Americas proved it. But there is another mystery that makes this question even stranger. The Lycurgus cup. At first, it looks like an ordinary ancient Roman glass vessel. Then light passes through it, and the cup changes color. When illuminated from one direction, it appears green. When the light comes from another direction, it becomes reddish. For centuries, nobody fully understood why. Modern microscopic analysis eventually revealed the secret. Tiny particles of gold and silver had been embedded into the glass. These nanoparticles interact with light, creating the remarkable color-changing effect. Today, nanotechnology is associated with advanced laboratories and precision manufacturing. But someone in the ancient world was manipulating materials at a microscopic level. They may not have understood nanoparticles in the language of modern science, but they clearly understood that combining particular materials in particular proportions produced a remarkable optical effect. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson hidden inside these artifacts. Ancient people didn't need to understand modern scientific theory to discover scientific principles. They could observe, experiment, fail, try again, and eventually succeed. The result could look almost magical to us thousands of years later. So, when we discover an ancient artifact that seems impossible, perhaps we should resist two extremes. One extreme says ancient people were primitive and incapable of sophisticated engineering. The other says every unexplained object must have come from aliens, lost super civilizations, or time travelers. The truth is usually harder to find, and sometimes much more fascinating, because the real mystery may not be what ancient people had. It may be what they knew, and what we have forgotten. Thousands of years from now, future archaeologists may discover our smartphones buried beneath the ruins of our cities. They might find a device capable of communication, photography, navigation, entertainment, banking, translation, and access to an enormous network of information. If the battery had disappeared and the operating system could no longer be understood, they might assume it was ceremonial. They might argue that the strange glass surface was symbolic. They might wonder why people carried glowing rectangles everywhere. And perhaps someone would eventually say that the object was simply too advanced for the civilization that created it. We would know better. And that is exactly why ancient mysteries deserve caution. The unknown does not automatically mean impossible. Sometimes it simply means forgotten. And somewhere beneath the sands, inside an abandoned tomb, buried beneath a ruined city, or resting silently in the darkness of an ancient quarry, there may still be objects waiting to remind us just how much of human history has disappeared. The question is not whether the ancient world was capable of extraordinary things. It clearly was. The real question is how many extraordinary things have we still not discovered? Imagine discovering an object buried beneath the earth that appears to belong to a technological age thousands of years in the future. Not a monument, not a statue, not a simple tool, but something that looks engineered. Something with moving parts, precise geometry, or materials that seem completely out of place. The first question would be obvious. Who made it? The second question would be much harder. How? And the third could change everything. What if the people who created it were not supposed to have that technology? Throughout history, archaeologists have discovered objects that challenge our assumptions about what ancient civilizations were capable of. Some have perfectly reasonable explanations. Others remain debated. And a few have become legends because nobody can completely explain how they were made. One of the most famous examples is the Baghdad Battery. In the 1930s, archaeologists working in Iraq encountered a strange clay vessel containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. At first, it looked like an ordinary container, but the arrangement was unusual. The copper cylinder surrounded the iron rod without directly touching it. The top of the vessel appeared to have been sealed with a material resembling bitumen. And then someone asked a strange question. Could this ancient object have produced electricity? The idea sounds ridiculous at first. Electricity is usually associated with modern civilization, power stations, wires, and electronics. But a basic battery does not require any of those things. It requires two different metals and an electrolyte. So researchers recreated the object. They placed an acidic liquid inside, such as vinegar. The result? A small electrical potential could be produced. Not enough to power a modern device. Not enough to illuminate an ancient city, but enough to demonstrate that the basic design could function electrochemically. And suddenly, one of the strangest archaeological debates began. Was the Baghdad Battery actually a battery? Nobody knows. There are no surviving ancient instructions saying, this device produces electricity. There are no wires connected to it. No ancient lamps have been discovered with a clear connection to the object. And no archaeological context proves that electricity was being generated. Some researchers have proposed that it could have been used for electroplating. Others believe it was simply a container. Some think it may have held sacred scrolls or religious materials. And this uncertainty matters, because an experiment showing that an object can produce electricity does not prove that electricity was its original purpose. Still, the possibility is fascinating. Imagine an ancient craftsman discovering that certain metals and liquids produced a strange sensation. Perhaps a small spark. Perhaps a mild shock. Perhaps an unexplained effect. Without understanding electrons or chemistry, they could still recognize that something unusual was happening. Ancient science did not need modern vocabulary. It needed observation. And observation was something ancient civilizations mastered. Consider another remarkable invention from the ancient world: the automated temple door. More than 2,000 years ago, the Greek mathematician and engineer Heron of Alexandria described a system that could make enormous temple doors appear to open automatically. There was no electricity, no electric motor, no computer. Instead, the mechanism used heat, water, air pressure, weights, ropes, and pulleys. A fire beneath a container heated the air and water inside. Pressure moved the system. Water entered another container. The increasing weight pulled ropes connected to the doors. Slowly, almost mysteriously, the massive doors opened. To someone who didn't understand the mechanism, it could have looked like divine intervention. Imagine standing outside a temple in the ancient world. You watch priests approach. No one touches the doors. Then, as the ritual begins, the enormous entrance slowly moves. The temple opens. The crowd watches in silence. For the people who didn't know what was happening behind the walls, this wasn't engineering. It was magic. And that may have been the point. Technology has always had the ability to create wonder. Modern humans experience this every day. A smartphone can recognize your face. A satellite can locate you from space. Artificial intelligence can generate images and voices. A small aircraft can cross an ocean. To someone from 2,000 years ago, these things would appear supernatural. But the ancient world had its own technological surprises, and some were much more sophisticated than we usually imagine. Take Roman engineering. The Roman Empire built roads, aqueducts, bridges, tunnels, amphitheaters, and enormous concrete structures across vast territories. Roman concrete is especially fascinating. Some ancient structures have survived for nearly 2,000 years, despite constant exposure to water and harsh environmental conditions. Modern concrete often deteriorates over time. Yet some Roman marine structures became stronger after being exposed to seawater. Researchers have studied the chemistry behind this unusual durability. The Romans didn't have modern chemistry laboratories. They didn't understand molecular structures. But they had something equally important: experience. They knew which materials worked. They knew how mixtures behaved. And they passed that knowledge from one generation to another. The same principle may explain another ancient mystery: the rust-resistant Iron Pillar of Delhi. Standing more than 7 meters tall, this enormous iron column has survived for roughly 1,600 years. Despite being exposed to the environment for centuries, it shows remarkably little corrosion. For a long time, the pillar seemed almost impossible. How could ancient metalworkers create iron that resisted rust so effectively? Modern analysis has revealed that the answer is not supernatural. Its unusual composition, manufacturing technique, and environmental conditions all contributed to its preservation. But that doesn't make the achievement less impressive. It makes it more interesting. Because ancient metallurgists were doing sophisticated chemistry without the instruments we associate with chemistry today. They didn't need to know exactly why a process worked. They needed to know that it worked. And that distinction appears again and again in ancient history. The Antikythera mechanism may be the ultimate example. Imagine opening a wooden box recovered from a shipwreck. Inside is a corroded mass of bronze. At first, it looks like nothing more than debris. Then researchers notice gears, dozens of them, tiny teeth, rotating components, inscribed scales, and suddenly an ancient object becomes something completely different. A machine. The Antikythera mechanism could model astronomical cycles. It could track the movements of celestial bodies. It could predict eclipses. It could represent lunar phases. It could even help determine the timing of major athletic events. The precision is extraordinary. But perhaps the most mysterious part isn't the mechanism itself. It's what the mechanism tells us about the people who built it. Someone had to design it. Someone had to understand mathematics. Someone had to understand astronomy. Someone had to manufacture tiny gears with enough precision for the system to work. And someone had to teach these skills to others. Yet only fragments of this technological tradition survived. Why? Perhaps because knowledge is fragile. A civilization can possess brilliant engineers and still collapse. A library can burn. A workshop can disappear. A master craftsman can die without an apprentice. A war can scatter an entire community. A language can vanish. And suddenly, technology that once seemed ordinary becomes impossible to reproduce. This is why some ancient discoveries feel like messages from another civilization. They aren't necessarily evidence of visitors from space. They may be evidence of something much more human: lost knowledge. There is another artifact that demonstrates just how easily technology can become mysterious: the Lycurgus cup. This ancient Roman vessel changes color depending on how light passes through it. Green from one direction, red from another. For centuries, no one understood the effect. Modern researchers eventually discovered that tiny particles of gold and silver were embedded within the glass. The effect is a result of how those particles interact with light. Today we call these particles nanoparticles. The Romans obviously didn't have electron microscopes. They couldn't describe nanotechnology in modern scientific language. Yet somehow, the material was produced. Maybe they discovered the effect through experimentation. Maybe generations of glassmakers gradually refined the technique. Maybe they simply found a combination that worked and protected the secret. We may never know. But this raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if ancient civilizations possessed dozens of technologies that disappeared because nobody wrote down how they worked? What if a mysterious artifact isn't evidence of impossible technology? What if it is evidence of technology we simply don't understand anymore? There is a dangerous temptation to look at an ancient object and compare it directly with modern technology. A carved object resembles an airplane. A metal device resembles a battery. A stone structure resembles a machine component. A mysterious symbol resembles a modern circuit. But resemblance alone cannot establish function. The human brain is extremely good at finding patterns, sometimes too good. That is why archaeology demands evidence. Context, dating, materials, manufacturing traces, experimental reconstruction, independent verification. Without these things, a mystery can quickly become a myth. And myths have a way of becoming stronger every time they're repeated. But even after the exaggerated stories are removed, the ancient world remains astonishing. Because real history doesn't need aliens to be fascinating. Ancient humans were already capable of things that seem almost impossible. They could move enormous stones, build precise astronomical instruments, develop complex medical procedures, create sophisticated hydraulic systems, engineer durable metals, produce advanced glass, construct cities with drainage networks, and navigate enormous distances without satellites. The deeper we look into the past, the more complicated the picture becomes. Civilization was not a simple march from primitive tools to modern machines. It was a series of experiments. Some succeeded, some failed, some disappeared, and some were rediscovered centuries later. Perhaps that is why these artifacts continue to haunt us. They don't simply ask what ancient people knew. They ask what we have forgotten. And somewhere beneath the soil, there may be another object waiting. Something small enough to fit inside a human hand. Something that survived a civilization that disappeared thousands of years ago. Something that might force us to ask the same question all over again. Who made this? Why did they make it? And how did they know how to do it? Because sometimes the most disturbing discoveries aren't the ones that prove history is wrong. They're the ones that reveal how much of history we never knew in the first place. What if the most dangerous assumption we make about the ancient world is that our ancestors were less intelligent than we are? We have computers. They had stone. We have satellites. They watched the stars with their own eyes. We have precision machines. They had patience, mathematics, and generations of accumulated knowledge. And yet every few years, archaeologists uncover something that forces us to reconsider just how sophisticated ancient societies could become. One of the strangest examples comes from a place where almost nothing should have survived. The Taklamakan Desert. Known as one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, the desert preserves things that would normally disappear within centuries. Leather, wood, textiles, even human remains. And among the discoveries made, there was something remarkably ordinary. A saddle. Except it wasn't ordinary at all. It was one of the oldest known saddles ever discovered. The saddle was made from pieces of leather carefully stitched together and filled with materials such as straw and animal hair. At first, it may sound like a simple invention. But a saddle changes the relationship between humans and animals. It allows a rider to travel farther, faster, with greater stability. It transforms horses from animals that carry loads into partners in transportation, warfare, communication, and exploration. And this particular discovery revealed something else. The person buried with the saddle was a woman. She had been buried wearing riding equipment. That detail matters because history has often been told through assumptions. For decades, researchers imagined ancient riding cultures primarily through male warriors and hunters. But archaeology keeps producing evidence that complicates those assumptions. The ancient world was not always organized the way modern stereotypes suggest. And sometimes, a single burial can completely change our understanding of an entire culture. The same is true in another part of Asia, the Indus Valley Civilization. Thousands of years ago, cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa developed sophisticated systems of urban planning. Their streets were carefully organized. Their houses often had drainage systems. Some buildings contained wells. Wastewater could be directed away from living areas through carefully constructed channels. And the civilization used standardized weights and measurements. That last detail is easy to overlook. But standardization is one of the foundations of complex society. Imagine trying to build a city if every builder used a different measurement system. Imagine trading grain if every merchant used different weights. Imagine constructing enormous buildings without standardized units. It would be chaos. Yet the people of the Indus Valley developed systems that allowed measurements to remain consistent across enormous distances. They were also using sophisticated rulers. Some ancient measuring devices discovered in the region were divided into remarkably precise intervals. The technology may look simple, but precision is never simple. To create a reliable measurement system, someone has to decide what the units mean. Someone has to reproduce them. Someone has to enforce consistency. And someone has to teach the next generation. This is not primitive thinking. It is organized scientific thinking. But perhaps the most intriguing part of the Indus Valley civilization is what we still don't understand. Its writing system remains undeciphered. Thousands of symbols have been discovered. But without a confirmed translation, we can't easily read their records. Imagine having an entire civilization sitting in front of you, yet its own people remain largely silent. We can excavate their houses. We can study their tools. We can reconstruct their cities. But their thoughts remain hidden. What did they believe? What stories did they tell? Who were their kings? How did they organize their society? What technologies did they possess? We don't know. And that silence creates one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Now travel thousands of miles away to South America. There, enormous stone spheres have been discovered across Costa Rica. Some are small enough to carry. Others are several meters across. Many are astonishingly round. They were carved from hard volcanic stone. And researchers still debate exactly why they were created. Were they symbols of status, territorial markers, astronomical objects, ceremonial monuments, or something else? The most interesting detail is that their perfection does not require futuristic technology. Ancient craftsmen could have achieved remarkable results through repeated grinding, hammering, measuring, and polishing. But doing so would have required enormous effort. The question isn't necessarily how they could make them. It's why they invested so much labor into making them. And this distinction appears throughout archaeology. Sometimes the mystery isn't technological. It's cultural. We know humans could do something. We simply don't know why they chose to do it. Consider the carved stone balls of Scotland. Hundreds have been discovered. They date back thousands of years. They are generally similar in size but can have different numbers of raised knobs. Some contain intricate geometric patterns. Others are much simpler. And despite decades of study, their exact purpose remains uncertain. They aren't obviously weapons. They aren't clearly tools. They don't show consistent evidence of practical use. So perhaps they were symbolic. Maybe they represented authority. Maybe they were connected to rituals. Maybe they were used in social games. Or perhaps they served a purpose we no longer recognize. This is where archaeology becomes almost like detective work. A detective finds an object at a crime scene and asks what happened. An archaeologist finds an object thousands of years later and asks the same question. Who used it? How? When? Why? And what happened to the people who left it behind? But sometimes, the evidence creates more questions than answers. The Roman dodecahedron is a perfect example. More than 100 of these strange objects have been discovered across parts of Europe. They are usually made of metal. They have 12 flat faces. Each face contains a circular hole, and small knobs appear around the corners. The size varies. The decoration varies, but the basic design remains recognizable. And here's the strange part. We don't know what they were for. No Roman text clearly explains them. No ancient manual describes their use. No obvious practical function has been universally accepted. Proposed theories include measuring devices, surveying instruments, candle holders, knitting tools, astronomical instruments, religious objects, even gaming pieces. One discovery contained traces of wax, supporting the candle holder theory. But one example doesn't necessarily explain all the others. And that's the problem. The dodecahedrons may have had different functions, or they may have served a symbolic purpose that modern researchers simply don't understand. Perhaps the most important lesson is that ancient technology wasn't always designed to solve problems we recognize today. Some objects may have been created for rituals, for identity, for status, for religion, for ceremonies, or simply because people enjoyed making beautiful and mysterious things. Now imagine taking one of our modern objects and removing all documentation. Suppose future archaeologists discovered a golf ball. They might think it was a ceremonial sphere, a stress relief object, a child's toy, or perhaps a symbolic representation of the moon. Without knowing golf existed, almost any interpretation would be possible. The same problem exists with ancient artifacts. Context is everything. And when context disappears, speculation fills the gap. But sometimes we discover objects in contexts that create even more confusion. In the late 19th century, workers in Austria discovered a strange metallic object while breaking apart coal. It became known as the Salzburg Cube, or the Wolfsegg iron. The object appeared strangely shaped. It had rounded surfaces, flat sections, a groove around the middle, and a pitted exterior. The coal it was supposedly found inside was believed to be extremely ancient. That immediately produced extraordinary theories. Some suggested it was a piece of advanced machinery. Others thought it could have come from a meteorite. And some even suggested that it was evidence of an unknown civilization. But there was a problem. The geological context was never securely established. The object itself was later examined by researchers who found no convincing evidence that it was extraterrestrial. Some explanations suggested it was a much more recent human-made object, possibly connected to industrial activity. And then the artifact disappeared from public view. Again, a mystery was born. But disappearance doesn't make something supernatural. It simply makes the evidence harder to examine. And that distinction is critical. The same problem appears with another famous object, the so-called Dropa stones. According to stories that circulated during the 20th century, archaeologists in China discovered strange stone discs inside caves. The discs supposedly contained spiral inscriptions describing visitors from another planet. According to the legend, these beings arrived thousands of years ago after their spacecraft crashed. They were allegedly hunted by local people. Eventually, their story supposedly disappeared. It sounds like the perfect ancient astronaut mystery. But when researchers attempted to verify the story, serious problems emerged. The archaeologists involved were difficult to identify. The supposed academic sources could not be reliably traced. The university records were missing, and no authenticated collection of the mysterious discs could be produced. The story appears to have grown through repetition rather than evidence. This is a perfect example of how archaeology can become mythology. A strange object is discovered. Someone proposes an unusual explanation. A magazine publishes the story. Another source repeats it. Then another. Eventually, the claim begins to feel like established history. But repetition is not evidence. And that's why the real mysteries deserve even more attention. Because when the myths are removed, genuine discoveries remain. Take the Roman dodecahedrons, the Indus Valley measurement systems, the ancient saddle, the Costa Rican stone spheres, the Baghdad battery, the Antikythera mechanism, the Lycurgus cup. These are real archaeological objects. Their existence is not speculation. What remains uncertain is their purpose, their technology, or the knowledge behind them. And perhaps that is far more fascinating than any story about aliens, because it means human history is already strange enough. We don't need visitors from distant planets to explain every mystery. We need to accept that ancient humans were capable of remarkable innovation. They experimented. They observed. They engineered. They failed. They learned. And sometimes they succeeded so spectacularly that thousands of years later, we are still trying to understand how. But there is one final possibility. Perhaps some of the knowledge didn't disappear completely. Perhaps it survived in fragments. A technique passed from master to apprentice. A measurement system copied by another civilization. A forgotten engineering principle rediscovered centuries later. A material recipe hidden inside a workshop tradition. History may not be a straight line. It may be a web of lost discoveries, forgotten ideas, and knowledge that repeatedly vanished and returned. And somewhere inside that web are objects that still refuse to reveal their secrets. Objects buried beneath deserts. Objects resting inside tombs. Objects hidden beneath cities. Objects sitting quietly in museums, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Because the most frightening thing about the ancient world isn't that they may have known more than we think. It's that we may never know exactly how much they knew. What if the past is not as silent as we think? Beneath deserts, forests, mountains, and ancient cities, clues are still being uncovered. Some are ordinary objects. Some are monuments. And some are so strange that they seem to belong to a completely different chapter of human history. But there is one place where the line between natural formation and human construction becomes especially difficult to see. The ocean. More than 70% of our planet is covered by water. Yet compared with the land, only a tiny fraction of the underwater world has been explored in detail. That means entire landscapes could still be hiding beneath the waves. And one of the most famous examples is the Yonaguni Formation, near the southern tip of Japan. When a diver first noticed the structure in the 1980s, he saw something extraordinary. Huge terraces, sharp edges, broad steps, flat surfaces, long walls. From certain angles, it looked almost like the ruins of a gigantic underwater city. It was immediately tempting to imagine an ancient civilization standing there thousands of years ago. Perhaps a forgotten kingdom had been swallowed by the ocean. Perhaps earthquakes or rising sea levels had buried an entire settlement. And naturally, some people connected the formation to the legendary lost civilization of Atlantis. But there was a problem. Geologists who studied the formation argued that the rock could have been shaped naturally. The area is composed largely of sandstone and mudstone that can fracture along relatively straight lines. Underwater erosion, tectonic activity, and natural weathering can create surprisingly geometric patterns. And if you look at the structure closely, some of its supposed walls aren't perfectly straight. Some surfaces are irregular. Some angles don't behave like deliberate architecture. There are no universally accepted inscriptions, no confirmed tools, no unmistakable artifacts, no human remains, no settlement surrounding it. That doesn't prove the formation is entirely natural, but it means there is currently no solid archaeological evidence that an ancient civilization built it. And that distinction is crucial, because sometimes nature can imitate architecture so perfectly that the human brain immediately assumes someone must have constructed it. The same thing happens on land. In Saudi Arabia, the Al-Nasla rock appears to have been sliced almost perfectly in half. Two enormous stones stand upright on tiny-looking supports. Between them is a remarkably straight vertical gap. From a distance, it looks almost as if someone took an enormous blade and cut the rock cleanly in two. Naturally, theories about ancient lasers and advanced technology quickly appeared. But geology offers another explanation. Natural fractures can develop along weaknesses inside rock. Temperature changes, erosion, tectonic stress, and gradual weathering can widen these cracks over immense periods of time. The result can look engineered even when nobody touched it. And this raises a fascinating question. How often have humans mistaken nature for technology? Perhaps more often than we realize. But the opposite question is even more interesting. How often have we mistaken ancient technology for natural formations? That possibility brings us to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern era, Göbekli Tepe. Located in southeastern Turkey, this ancient site contains enormous carved stones that are more than 10,000 years old. Some of the pillars stand several meters tall. Many contain carvings of animals, snakes, foxes, birds, wild boars, other mysterious symbols. The pillars themselves are shaped in ways that sometimes appear almost human. Arms and hands can be recognized on some examples. But what makes Göbekli Tepe extraordinary isn't simply its age. It's the implications. For decades, archaeologists believed that large-scale monumental architecture developed after humans became farmers. The traditional story was straightforward. Humans learned agriculture. Agriculture produced food surpluses. Food surpluses allowed permanent settlements. Permanent settlements produced social organization. Social organization eventually produced monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe complicated that sequence. The site appears to have been built by hunter-gatherer communities, people who were not yet living in the kind of agricultural society once considered necessary for such monumental construction. So why did they build it? Was it a religious center? A place for communal gatherings? A ritual complex? A location where different groups met? Perhaps all of these. The more archaeologists excavate, the more complicated the story becomes. And the site may not have been an isolated phenomenon. Nearby discoveries suggest that the region contained multiple monumental sites built during roughly the same broad period. This means something significant was happening in this part of the world more than 10,000 years ago. Humans were organizing large groups. They were quarrying stone, transporting massive pillars, planning structures, creating symbols, and carving detailed animals into stone. None of this requires futuristic technology, but it does require sophisticated social organization. And perhaps that is one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient civilizations. We often confuse technological simplicity with intellectual simplicity. A society without computers can still understand mathematics. A society without engines can still understand mechanics. A society without steel cranes can still move enormous stones. A society without modern medicine can still develop effective surgical techniques. Ancient India offers a remarkable example. More than 2,000 years ago, the physician Sushruta described surgical procedures in extraordinary detail. His writings included techniques for reconstructing noses. The procedure involved transferring skin from another part of the body. Today, reconstructive surgery uses vastly more advanced tools and knowledge. But the basic concept is remarkably old. The ancient technique became particularly important in societies where loss of the nose could occur as punishment or through injury. The surgeon had to understand anatomy, blood supply, tissue, healing, and precise cutting. Again, there was no modern operating room, no anesthesia in the modern sense, no antibiotics. Yet surgical knowledge existed. The same civilization also made major contributions to mathematics. One of the most important ideas in human history is the number 0. Today, 0 seems obvious, but mathematically, it is revolutionary. It allows numbers to occupy positions. It makes complex calculations dramatically easier, and it eventually became essential to modern mathematics, computing, engineering, and science. The development of 0 was a long process involving several civilizations, but ancient Indian mathematicians played a crucial role in turning the concept into a formal mathematical number. Think about how strange that is. A symbol representing nothing eventually became one of the most powerful concepts in mathematics. Without it, modern computing would look completely different. And that leads us to another ancient Indian achievement: the concept of standardized measurement. The Indus Valley civilization used carefully standardized weights. They created rulers. They constructed buildings using consistent proportions. Their cities show remarkable regularity. Again, no futuristic machines were necessary. The real technology was organization, measurement, mathematics, planning, and knowledge passed between generations. But some ancient objects remain much harder to explain. One of them is the Sabu disk. Another is the Baghdad battery. Another is the Antikythera mechanism. And then there are artifacts whose mysteries have been amplified by exaggerated stories. The Khoso artifact is a perfect example. In the 1960s, 3 people searching for minerals in California discovered something inside a strange rock. It appeared to contain a modern-looking cylindrical object. Some believed it was an ancient technological device. Others proposed that it could have been evidence of an advanced civilization hundreds of thousands of years ago. The theories became increasingly dramatic. Atlantis, time travel, extraterrestrials, a lost civilization with technology far beyond our own. But eventually, investigators examined the object more carefully. The supposed ancient device turned out to be a 20th century spark plug, and the rock surrounding it wasn't an ancient geode. It was a concretion, a natural geological formation that can develop around objects over relatively short periods of time. The mystery collapsed, but something important remained: the lesson. A strange discovery can produce extraordinary theories when its context isn't understood. And that is why archaeology requires skepticism. Not because ancient people were incapable of extraordinary things, but because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There is another famous example: the so-called London Hammer. A modern-looking hammer was found embedded in a rock formation in Texas. Some people claimed the surrounding stone was millions of years old. If that were true, it would suggest that humans had been manufacturing metal tools alongside dinosaurs. But geological analysis provided a much simpler explanation. The rock had formed around the hammer much later. Minerals can accumulate around objects and create hard incrustations that look incredibly old. The hammer wasn't evidence of humans living alongside dinosaurs. It was an ordinary object caught in an unusual geological process. And yet, these stories continue because they are compelling. They challenge the boundaries of what we think is possible. But the real world doesn't always provide satisfying answers. Sometimes an artifact remains unexplained. Sometimes its original purpose is lost forever. Sometimes an archaeological site is destroyed before researchers can study it. And sometimes the evidence is simply too incomplete. That is where the mystery lives. Not in certainty, but in the gap between what we know and what we cannot yet prove. Imagine future archaeologists discovering a modern airport after civilization has collapsed. They find runways stretching across the ground, huge metal machines, control towers, seats, wires, screens. They don't understand electricity. They don't know what aviation is. They don't have access to our written records. How would they interpret the evidence? Perhaps they would invent theories. Maybe the runways were ceremonial. Maybe the aircraft were giant sculptures. Maybe the towers were religious monuments. Maybe the machines were designed to frighten enemies. Without context, even familiar technology becomes mysterious. Now reverse that thought. We are the future archaeologists, and the ancient world is our airport. We are looking at fragments of a civilization whose languages, beliefs, technologies, and traditions have been partially erased by time. We are trying to reconstruct an entire world from broken pieces: a stone, a metal object, a burial, a wall, a mysterious machine, a carved symbol. Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we don't. And sometimes the evidence is simply not enough. But every new excavation adds another piece. A hidden tomb, a buried settlement, a forgotten workshop, a lost road, a sunken structure, a fragment of an ancient machine. And perhaps one day, archaeologists will uncover something that changes the entire conversation. Not because it proves aliens visited Earth, not because it proves Atlantis existed, but because it reveals that an ordinary human civilization was far more inventive, organized, and technically skilled than we ever imagined. That would be a discovery worth rewriting the textbooks for. Because perhaps the greatest mystery isn't whether ancient people possessed technology that was impossible for their time. Perhaps the greatest mystery is how much technology they possessed, and how much of it disappeared before anyone could preserve the story. For thousands of years, humans have looked at the ruins of ancient civilizations and assumed we understood the story. Stone tools, wooden sleds, primitive machines, simple mathematics. That was the world of the ancient past, or so we were taught. But then archaeologists began uncovering objects that seemed to challenge that picture. Massive stones weighing hundreds of tons. Ancient devices with astonishing mechanical precision. Artifacts whose purpose remains unknown. Objects that appear strangely similar to technologies invented thousands of years later. And in some cases, discoveries that were once presented as evidence of impossible ancient technology were eventually exposed as misunderstandings, hoaxes, or natural formations. The deeper we dig, the stranger the story becomes. Because perhaps the real mystery isn't whether ancient civilizations possessed futuristic technology. Perhaps the real mystery is how much knowledge they actually had, and how much of it disappeared. Imagine standing inside an ancient stone chamber surrounded by walls built thousands of years ago. There are no electric lights, no engines, no modern cranes, no computers. Yet the stones around you fit together with astonishing precision. You run your hand across the surface. The stone is smooth, almost impossibly smooth. Then you look upward and realize something even more disturbing. Some of the blocks above you weigh hundreds of tons. Who moved them? How? And why would people go to such extraordinary lengths to build something that has survived long after their civilization disappeared? This is where the mystery of ancient technology begins. One of the most spectacular examples can be found in Lebanon, at the ancient site of Baalbek. The ruins have fascinated historians for centuries. Massive stone blocks form the foundations of monumental Roman structures, including the Temple of Jupiter. Some of the stones are enormous by any reasonable standard. At the nearby quarry, archaeologists discovered gigantic unfinished monoliths. Their size immediately raises the obvious question. Why would ancient builders quarry stones so large that even modern construction equipment would struggle to move them? One famous example is known as the Stone of the South. It was never completely separated from the bedrock. Nearby, other enormous stones were also discovered, including one weighing more than 1,000 tons. These discoveries have inspired countless theories. Some claim that ancient builders possessed sophisticated machines that have been lost. Others argue that the stones were moved through a combination of ramps, ropes, wooden structures, levers, manpower, and careful engineering. And this second explanation is important, because ancient people did not need modern technology to accomplish extraordinary things. They needed time, organization, thousands of workers, and an understanding of physics gained through generations of experimentation. The absence of machines does not mean the absence of engineering. In fact, sometimes the engineering itself is the machine. But Baalbek is only the beginning. Travel south into Egypt, and the mysteries become even more complicated. Inside the ancient necropolis of Saqqara lies the Serapeum, a massive underground complex containing enormous granite sarcophagi. Some of these boxes weigh dozens of tons. They were carved from extremely hard stone, transported over long distances, lowered into underground chambers, and positioned with remarkable precision. Even today, moving such objects requires specialized equipment. So how did ancient workers accomplish it? The answer may lie in techniques that have simply disappeared. Ancient Egyptians understood ramps. They understood leverage. They understood counterweights. They understood friction. They understood how to organize enormous labor forces. But there is another question. How did they achieve such precision? That is where artifacts like the Lycurgus cup become fascinating. The cup is a Roman-era glass vessel famous for its unusual color-changing effect. When illuminated from one direction, the glass appears one color. Change the direction of the light, and the cup transforms. Modern analysis revealed something extraordinary. Tiny particles of gold and silver were embedded within the glass. These nanoparticles interact with light and create the remarkable color effect. The ancient craftsmen obviously did not possess modern microscopes. They could not see nanoparticles. Yet somehow the correct materials were incorporated into the glass. Was it deliberate? Most likely. But how exactly did Roman craftsmen discover the precise mixture and manufacturing process? That remains one of the most fascinating questions surrounding the artifact. And this is where we need to be careful. Ancient technology does not automatically mean lost super technology. Sometimes the truth is even more impressive. Ancient craftsmen could develop techniques through trial and error without understanding the modern scientific principles behind them. A blacksmith did not need to understand atomic structure to make strong metal. A glassmaker did not need quantum physics to discover that certain mixtures changed color. A builder did not need modern structural engineering software to understand how weight behaved. Knowledge can exist without the scientific language we use to describe it. But there are discoveries where even the practical explanation remains uncertain. Consider the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from an ancient shipwreck near Greece, this device contains an intricate system of gears. It could model astronomical cycles, track the movements of celestial bodies, predict eclipses, and represent complex calendar systems. The mechanism dates to roughly 2,000 years ago. For centuries, nothing remotely comparable was known. Then suddenly, in the ancient world, we find a machine with sophisticated gearing that seems almost completely out of place. It wasn't a computer in the modern electronic sense. There were no microchips, no electricity, no software. But mechanically, it was extraordinary. And perhaps that is the real lesson. We often define technology according to what exists today. We imagine progress as a straight line. Stone tools become bronze. Bronze becomes iron. Iron becomes steel. Mechanical devices become engines. Engines become computers. But history rarely moves in a straight line. Knowledge can appear. Knowledge can spread. Knowledge can disappear. And sometimes, a civilization can become exceptionally advanced in one field while remaining relatively simple in another. The ancient Greeks could develop sophisticated astronomical instruments while living without many technologies we consider basic. The Romans could construct enormous roads and aqueducts while relying on animal power. The Egyptians could build monumental architecture without modern cranes. This uneven development is one reason ancient history is so easy to misunderstand. And then there are the objects that seem to cross the boundary between genuine ancient technology and modern imagination. The Baghdad Battery is one example. Discovered in the region of modern Iraq, the artifact consists of a clay vessel, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. When filled with an acidic liquid, experimental reconstructions demonstrate that the arrangement can produce a small electrical potential. Immediately, the idea became irresistible. Did ancient people understand electricity? Could they have used it for electroplating? Were they experimenting with electrical reactions? Or was the object simply a container with another purpose? We do not have ancient texts clearly explaining it as a battery. That uncertainty matters. A device that can produce electricity is not necessarily a battery designed by its makers to produce electricity. But the possibility remains intriguing. And then comes an even stranger category: objects that appear technologically impossible because they are found in geological contexts that seem far older than humanity itself. These are often called out-of-place artifacts. Some are genuine archaeological objects misunderstood by later observers. Others are natural formations. Some are hoaxes. And some have ordinary explanations that became extraordinary through repetition. The Khoso artifact is a perfect example. For decades, it was presented as a mysterious object found inside a mineralized stone. Some believed it might represent an advanced technology hundreds of thousands of years old. But eventually, examination showed that the object was a 20th century spark plug. The surrounding material was not ancient geological rock formed over millions of years. It was a concretion, a natural mineral deposit that can form around objects over comparatively short periods. The mystery disappeared, but something else remained. The lesson. A strange discovery can become more mysterious each time the story is retold. A questionable claim becomes an archaeological fact. A theory becomes a possibility. A possibility becomes a headline. And eventually, people forget to ask whether the original evidence was ever strong. This is why the ancient world requires something more difficult than imagination. It requires skepticism. Because if we accept every mysterious artifact as evidence of lost super technology, we stop investigating. We stop asking the most important question: what actually happened? Maybe ancient civilizations did possess technologies that have been completely lost. Maybe certain engineering techniques were far more sophisticated than we realize. Maybe some discoveries will force historians to revise accepted timelines. But there is another possibility. The past may be extraordinary enough without adding anything supernatural. Ancient people were intelligent. They experimented. They failed. They learned. They observed nature for generations. And sometimes they created things that still leave us speechless. The greatest mystery may not be that ancient humans built impossible machines. It may be that we have underestimated what humans were capable of all along. And if that is true, then every buried artifact, every forgotten workshop, every unexplained mechanism, and every enormous stone could represent something far more important than evidence of aliens or lost civilizations. It could be evidence of something much closer to home: human ingenuity. And somewhere beneath the ruins, there may still be technologies waiting to be understood. Not because they came from the future, but because we forgot how to make them. By now, one question should be impossible to ignore. What if the ancient world was not primitive at all? What if our picture of the past has been distorted by the simple fact that most ancient technology did not survive? Think about what happens to modern technology when civilization disappears. A smartphone left in the wilderness would eventually break apart. Plastic would degrade. Batteries would corrode. Buildings would collapse. Electronic records could disappear. Factories would vanish beneath soil and vegetation. After a few thousand years, future archaeologists might discover only fragments of our civilization. A strange piece of metal, a broken circuit board, a road buried beneath layers of earth. Perhaps they would have no idea what any of it was used for. Now imagine going back thousands of years. That is exactly the problem archaeologists face. We are looking at the remains of civilizations that existed before modern science, modern documentation, and modern preservation. And sometimes, the fragments they left behind are astonishing. One of the most fascinating examples comes from ancient Egypt. The so-called Sabu disc was discovered inside a tomb at Saqqara and dates back more than 4,000 years. It is made from a fragile stone called schist. The object has a circular shape with 3 curved projections extending inward from its outer edge. At first glance, it looks almost impossible to understand. What was it? A ceremonial object? A bowl? A decorative piece? A mechanical component? One unusual theory suggests that its shape resembles an impeller, the rotating component of a centrifugal pump. Modern replicas have demonstrated that a similar shape can create a vortex when rotated. That sounds remarkable. But there is an important problem. We do not have definitive evidence that ancient Egyptians used the disc as a pump. The interpretation remains speculative. And yet, even without the futuristic theories, the artifact raises a fascinating question. Why would someone thousands of years ago create such a complex shape from such fragile stone? Sometimes the mystery is not about technology from another world. It is about technology whose original context has disappeared. The same problem appears when we examine the famous Roman dodecahedrons. More than 100 of these strange objects have been discovered across parts of the former Roman world. They are hollow, 12-sided objects with circular openings of different sizes. Many have small knobs at the corners. Some were decorated. Some were found with other artifacts. But despite decades of research, their exact purpose remains unknown. Were they measuring instruments? Candle holders? Surveying tools? Knitting devices? Astronomical instruments? Something connected to religious rituals? No single explanation has gained universal acceptance. And that uncertainty tells us something important. Sometimes an artifact can survive while its meaning completely disappears. Imagine finding a modern smartphone 2,000 years from now without electricity, networks, chargers, operating systems, or written instructions. A future civilization might think it was a mirror, a ceremonial tablet, a piece of jewelry, maybe even a religious object. They could create dozens of theories, and every theory might sound reasonable. That is the archaeological problem. We possess the object. We often don't possess the explanation. Now consider the carved stone balls discovered mainly in Scotland. Hundreds have been found. They date back to prehistoric times and come in different shapes and patterns. Many have carefully arranged knobs covering their surfaces. Some are beautifully symmetrical. Yet archaeologists still debate their purpose. They are generally too small and awkward to be ordinary tools. They show little evidence of heavy use. That has led researchers to consider symbolic or social explanations. Perhaps they represented status. Perhaps they were connected to authority or ritual. Perhaps they had a function we simply don't recognize anymore. And then there are the mysterious Neolithic stone drums discovered in Britain. Their surfaces contain intricate geometric designs. Some even contain stylized faces. The craftsmanship is remarkable. But again, the original purpose remains uncertain. Were they musical instruments? Ceremonial objects? Symbols of identity? Tools? Or something else entirely? The more we investigate ancient artifacts, the more we discover a frustrating pattern. The technology may survive. The instructions do not. And sometimes, even the civilization that created the object disappears. That brings us to another extraordinary question. What happens when an entire technological tradition disappears? The answer can be found in ancient musical instruments. For centuries, researchers have tried to understand why certain historical violins possess such distinctive acoustic qualities. The instruments made by Antonio Stradivari are among the most famous. Hundreds survive. Musicians and collectors have valued them for generations. Scientists have examined their wood, varnish, construction techniques, and physical properties. Various theories have been proposed. Perhaps the answer lies in the wood. Perhaps climate affected the trees from which the instruments were made. Perhaps the varnish played a role. Perhaps the craftsmanship itself was responsible. Or perhaps several factors worked together. The important point is that the technology was not supernatural. It was craftsmanship. But craftsmanship can become a form of lost technology when the exact process is forgotten. That may have happened countless times throughout human history. Consider ancient metallurgy. In India, the famous iron pillar of Delhi has survived for roughly 16 centuries with remarkably little corrosion. Its unusual resistance to rust has fascinated scientists for generations. Modern studies have identified chemical and environmental factors that help explain its durability. But the broader achievement remains impressive. Ancient metalworkers developed sophisticated methods of producing large iron structures long before modern industrial metallurgy. And they did not leave behind a laboratory manual explaining every step. Their knowledge was embedded in practice, passed from craftsman to craftsman, from generation to generation, until eventually traditions changed. Workshops disappeared, empires collapsed, languages evolved, and techniques were forgotten. This may explain why certain ancient achievements look impossible to us. We are not necessarily looking at technology that was more advanced than ours. We are looking at technology developed for different purposes under different circumstances. Ancient builders had enormous amounts of labor available. They had generations to refine techniques. They could spend decades constructing monuments. Modern builders operate under completely different constraints. We prioritize speed, cost, efficiency, and safety. Ancient builders often prioritized permanence. A civilization could spend enormous resources constructing a monument intended to survive for thousands of years. That changes everything. Nowhere is this more obvious than at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. The site dates back more than 10,000 years. Its monumental stone pillars are carved with animals and symbols. Some are enormous. And what makes the site especially important is its age. It predates many traditional assumptions about the development of large-scale organized architecture. For a long time, historians imagined that agriculture came first. People settled. They developed farming. Villages expanded. Then cities emerged. Then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe complicated that story. The site suggests that hunter-gatherer communities were capable of organizing sophisticated construction projects much earlier than previously assumed. It does not prove that they possessed futuristic technology. It proves something perhaps more significant. Human social organization and engineering abilities may have developed earlier than we thought. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the ancient world, researchers continue to uncover structures that force historians to reconsider old assumptions. In the Andes, enormous stone constructions raise questions about transportation and engineering. At Pumapunku, massive, precisely shaped blocks have inspired theories ranging from advanced engineering to extraterrestrial intervention. But again, evidence matters. The fact that we do not yet understand every construction technique does not automatically mean the builders possessed technology more advanced than ours. It means there is still research to be done. And sometimes archaeology advances precisely because a mystery refuses to disappear. Take the stone spheres of Costa Rica. Hundreds of nearly spherical stones were created by ancient peoples. Some are almost perfectly rounded. Their purpose remains debated. They may have marked important locations. They may have represented status. They may have had astronomical or social meanings, but their creators did not leave us a written explanation. The civilization that produced them left behind clues, not answers. And that distinction is crucial, because the ancient world is filled with objects that become more mysterious when modern expectations are projected onto them. The Nazca lines are another example. Huge designs were created across the desert landscape of Peru. From the ground, many are difficult to recognize. From above, they become enormous geometric figures and representations of animals. The immediate question is obvious. Why would ancient people create designs that are easiest to see from the sky? Some have suggested extraterrestrial explanations. But researchers have demonstrated that ancient people could construct the lines using relatively simple surveying methods. The mystery is not necessarily how they made them. It is why. And that is often the deeper archaeological mystery. We can understand the engineering and still not understand the intention. A temple can be measured. A stone can be weighed. A tool can be replicated. But meaning is much harder to recover. Perhaps that is why ancient mysteries continue to fascinate us. They leave enough evidence to prove that something happened, but not enough evidence to tell us exactly why. And sometimes the most dangerous mistake is assuming that because we cannot explain something immediately, it must have required impossible technology. History has shown us otherwise. The Antikythera mechanism was once almost unbelievable. Now we understand much more about how it worked. The Lycurgus cup seemed mysterious until modern microscopy revealed the nanoparticles inside its glass. The Baghdad battery continues to provoke debate because its purpose remains uncertain. The Sabu disk remains fascinating because its original function has disappeared. The enormous stones of Baalbek still challenge us, but ancient engineering offers plausible ways they could have been transported. One mystery after another becomes less supernatural as evidence accumulates. But that does not make the ancient world less impressive. It makes it more human. Imagine a craftsman in ancient Egypt shaping stone by hand. He has no electric drill, no computer-controlled machinery, no digital measuring device. Yet through years of experience, he knows exactly how the material behaves. He knows where it will crack, how much pressure it can tolerate, which tool will produce the cleanest surface. That knowledge might never have been written down. It existed inside the craftsman's hands. And when that craftsman died, some of that knowledge died with him. Multiply that by thousands of generations. Suddenly, the archaeological record becomes something much more haunting. We are not just studying ruins. We are studying the remains of forgotten knowledge. Knowledge that once seemed ordinary to the people who possessed it. Knowledge that may have been passed from parent to child, master to apprentice, generation to generation, until one day, the chain broke. A war, a migration, a plague, a political collapse, a change in religion, a destroyed workshop, a language that disappeared, and suddenly, a technique that had survived for centuries became impossible to reproduce. Maybe that is the real secret hiding behind the world's ancient mysteries. Not visitors from distant planets, not machines from the future, but human knowledge that vanished. And if that is true, then somewhere beneath the sand, buried inside a forgotten tomb, hidden beneath the ruins of a lost settlement, there may be another artifact waiting. Something ordinary to the people who created it. Something incomprehensible to us. Something that could force us to ask the same question once again. What else did they know that we have forgotten? There is something deeply unsettling about discovering an object that seems to belong to the wrong century. A machine where no machine should exist. A map that appears to show places before they were supposedly discovered. A metal object trapped inside stone. A footprint that seems to belong to a human in a world where humans should not have existed. These discoveries have fascinated people for generations because they challenge one of our strongest assumptions about history: that the past follows a predictable timeline. But history is rarely that simple. Sometimes an artifact really does force us to rethink what we know. Sometimes the explanation is ordinary. And sometimes the mystery survives because there simply isn't enough evidence to close the case. One of the most famous examples is the Piri Reis map. Created in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, the surviving portion of the map shows parts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. What makes it fascinating is not simply its age. It is the collection of sources behind it. Piri Reis explained that he used multiple maps and charts to construct his work, including material connected to earlier Portuguese and Spanish exploration. He also referenced maps associated with Christopher Columbus. That is significant because some of the original charts he used have disappeared. The Piri Reis map therefore provides a rare window into geographical knowledge that might otherwise have been completely lost. But then came an extraordinary claim. Some researchers argued that the lower portion of the map represented Antarctica. Not Antarctica covered in ice today, but Antarctica before its ice sheet formed. If that were true, it would create a staggering problem. The modern understanding of Antarctica's geography developed thousands of years after the map was created. So how could a 16th century map show it? The theory became enormously popular. But detailed analysis did not support the claim. The coastline identified as Antarctica can be explained more naturally as part of South America, distorted by the limitations of the original map and the way its sources were combined. This is a perfect example of how ancient and historical mysteries evolve. A strange shape appears. Someone proposes an extraordinary interpretation. The interpretation becomes famous. Then later researchers examine the evidence more carefully. And the mystery changes. Not necessarily disappears. It becomes more interesting. Because now the question is not, did ancient people map Antarctica? The better question is, how much geographical knowledge was circulating through the ancient and medieval worlds that has been lost? That question brings us to another mysterious object, the Baghdad Battery. The artifact consists of a clay vessel containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When reconstructed and filled with an acidic liquid, similar arrangements can generate a small electrical voltage. That immediately created a spectacular possibility. Perhaps people in ancient Mesopotamia understood electricity. Maybe they used it for electroplating. Maybe they experimented with chemical reactions. Or perhaps the vessel had nothing to do with electricity at all. There is no surviving ancient document that says, "This is a battery." That missing evidence is important. A reconstruction can demonstrate what an object is capable of doing. It cannot automatically prove what the original makers intended. This distinction is often lost in documentaries and online videos. If an ancient object can produce electricity, that does not necessarily mean its creators understood electricity. If a stone shape can function as a pump, that does not prove it was designed as a pump. If an ancient model can glide through the air, that does not mean its creators built airplanes. Function and intention are not the same thing. And yet, the Baghdad Battery remains fascinating precisely because we do not know the full story. Now consider the so-called Antikythera mechanism. This object is different. Here, The evidence is overwhelming that the device was intentionally engineered. Inside a corroded collection of bronze fragments were dozens of precisely arranged gears. Researchers have reconstructed its functions using modern imaging, computer modeling, and mechanical analysis. It represented astronomical cycles. It could track lunar movements. It could predict eclipses. It incorporated calendar systems. And it may have displayed the timing of major athletic events. This was not a crude experiment. It was a sophisticated mechanical system. The real mystery is not whether the mechanism existed. It did. The mystery is how widespread this kind of technology was. Was the Antikythera mechanism a unique masterpiece created by one extraordinary inventor? Or was it one example from a larger technological tradition? If other machines like it existed, most may have disappeared. Bronze can be recycled. Wood rots. Ships sink. Libraries burn. Workshops collapse. A single surviving machine may therefore represent an entire technological tradition that we barely know existed. Imagine finding one modern computer in the distant future. Would that be enough to reconstruct the entire history of computing? Probably not. You might recognize the components. You might understand some of its functions. But without the manufacturing infrastructure, software, electrical grid, internet, and billions of other devices that surrounded it, you would have only a fragment. The Antikythera mechanism may be exactly that, a fragment of a much larger world. Then there are artifacts that seem to challenge not technology, but chronology itself. The so-called Meister print is one example. A fossil discovered in Utah contains the impression of what some people interpreted as a human sandal or shoe print. Inside the impression was a trilobite fossil. Trilobites disappeared hundreds of millions of years before modern humans appeared. If the impression were genuinely a human footprint, it would completely overturn our understanding of human evolution. But there is a problem. The evidence does not establish that it was a human footprint. Natural rock formations can create astonishingly convincing shapes. The human brain is exceptionally good at recognizing familiar patterns. We see faces in clouds, animals in shadows, structures on the surface of Mars. And sometimes we see footprints where geology has simply created an unusual depression. This is called pareidolia. It is not evidence of deception. It is a normal feature of human perception. But when the shape appears inside a scientifically interesting geological context, the temptation to believe the extraordinary explanation becomes powerful. The same thing happened with the London hammer. In the early 20th century, a hammer was reportedly discovered encased in a rock formation in Texas. Because the surrounding material appeared ancient, some claimed the hammer proved humans had existed alongside dinosaurs. The conclusion was dramatic. But geology offered a much simpler explanation. Mineral deposits can form around relatively modern objects. A hammer does not need to survive from the age of dinosaurs to become embedded in stone. It only needs the right environmental conditions. Again, the extraordinary claim collapsed under closer examination. And this pattern repeats across history. The Wolfsegg iron, sometimes called the Salzburg cube, is another strange object that became associated with ancient mysteries. It was reportedly discovered inside coal in Austria. Because the coal seam was considered extremely old, speculation quickly followed. Could the object have been manufactured millions of years ago? Could it be evidence of an advanced civilization before humanity? Could it even be extraterrestrial? But the object's geological context was never enough to prove its age. It may have been a much more recent object that became associated with the coal through industrial or geological processes. The object itself also disappeared from public view, making the mystery even harder to investigate. This illustrates one of the greatest problems in archaeology. Context is everything. An artifact without reliable context can become almost impossible to interpret. Where was it found? Exactly where? At what depth? What layer of sediment surrounded it? Was the layer undisturbed? Were other artifacts found nearby? Was the object documented immediately? Without these details, almost any story can be attached to an object. And sometimes that story becomes more famous than the evidence. There is another mysterious artifact that demonstrates this perfectly: the Roman dodecahedron. These objects are undeniably real. They exist in museums. They have been excavated from archaeological contexts. Their approximate age and cultural association can be established, but their purpose remains unknown. This is a genuine mystery. No alien explanation is required. No lost super-civilization is necessary. The simple fact that researchers cannot determine their function is already fascinating. Perhaps they were used for surveying, perhaps for crafts, perhaps rituals, perhaps something entirely different. This distinction is important. A genuine mystery does not require an extraordinary explanation. Sometimes the most honest answer is simply, we don't know. And we don't know is not a failure of science. It is the starting point of investigation. That is how the Antikythera mechanism was studied. Researchers did not begin by declaring it alien technology. They began by asking what the fragments actually contained. They photographed them, scanned them, studied their inscriptions, reconstructed the gears, compared the device with known astronomical systems. Slowly, the mystery became clearer. That is the difference between speculation and investigation. But even after the mechanism was understood, another mystery remained. Who built it? Where? Was the knowledge widespread? Did similar devices exist? How many were lost? We may never know. And perhaps that is the most haunting possibility of all. What if history is full of inventions we never discovered because only one example survived? What if entire workshops existed beneath cities that have never been excavated? What if ancient engineers developed techniques that vanished when their societies collapsed? What if some of the most important technological discoveries are still buried beneath fields, deserts, forests, and oceans? Archaeology is not the study of everything humans once knew. It is the study of what happened to survive. That difference is enormous. Most ancient knowledge may be gone forever, but every surviving artifact is a message from that lost world. Sometimes the message is clear. Sometimes it is damaged. Sometimes it is misleading. And sometimes it leaves us staring at an object with no idea what we are looking at. That is when the real mystery begins. Not with the question of whether ancient people had technology beyond their time, but with a much more unsettling question. How much of their technology disappeared without leaving a trace? Because if the Antikythera mechanism was not unique, if the builders of Baalbek had techniques we still struggle to reconstruct, if ancient craftsmen possessed specialized knowledge that vanished with their workshops, then the ancient world may have been far more technologically diverse than the surviving evidence suggests. And somewhere beneath the ground, another piece of that forgotten world may still be waiting. A gear, a tool, a blueprint, a machine, or perhaps something so ordinary that nobody recognizes its importance. Until one day, someone digs it out of the earth, and history changes again. What if the greatest ancient technologies were not the spectacular monuments we can see today, but the inventions that disappeared completely? We know about the pyramids because stone survives. We know about temples because their walls survived. We know about statues because they were carved from materials that could endure thousands of years. But what happened to the things ancient people made from wood, leather, fibers, organic materials, or fragile metals? Most of them are gone, and that creates a terrifying possibility. The archaeological record may be showing us only the skeleton of ancient technology. The machines are missing. The workshops are gone. The instructions have vanished. What remains are fragments. And sometimes, those fragments are enough to make us wonder whether the ancient world was far more inventive than we ever imagined. Consider the ancient Indian concept of the Vimana. Ancient Sanskrit literature describes extraordinary flying vehicles associated with gods, kings, warfare, and journeys through the sky. Some descriptions are highly imaginative. They speak of vehicles traveling enormous distances, performing extraordinary movements, and possessing supernatural abilities. Modern interpretations sometimes present these descriptions as evidence that ancient India possessed aircraft. But there is a major problem. The texts are not technical manuals in the modern sense. Many are religious, mythological, or literary works. Their descriptions belong to a world where gods, supernatural powers, and symbolic imagery are completely normal. That does not mean every detail was invented from nothing. Ancient cultures often transformed real observations into mythology. A powerful storm becomes a god. A brilliant celestial object becomes a divine chariot. A sophisticated machine becomes associated with supernatural beings. But there is currently no archaeological evidence showing that ancient Indians built powered aircraft comparable to modern airplanes. And that distinction matters. The mystery becomes less about proving ancient aviation and more about understanding why humans across cultures repeatedly imagined machines capable of flight. Perhaps the desire to conquer the sky is much older than technology itself. Humans looked upward. They watched birds. They watched the moon. They watched stars crossing the sky. And naturally, they dreamed of joining them. Thousands of years later, Leonardo da Vinci would sketch flying machines. His notebooks contain studies of wings, airflow, mechanical systems, and human flight. Most of his designs never became practical aircraft. But they demonstrate something important. A technological idea can exist centuries before the engineering required to make it possible. That may also explain why some ancient artifacts appear strangely futuristic. A model can represent an idea without being a functioning machine. One of the most famous examples is the Saqqara bird. Discovered in Egypt in the 19th century, this small wooden object resembles a bird. Its wings are extended. Its tail has an unusual shape. And because of its appearance, some researchers proposed that it might represent an ancient aircraft. The theory became especially popular after experimental replicas were constructed. Some models demonstrated limited gliding ability. But that does not prove that ancient Egyptians understood aerodynamics or built airplanes. The object could have been ceremonial. It could have been a toy. It could have represented a bird or a religious symbol. Its actual purpose remains uncertain. And perhaps the most interesting thing about the Saqqara bird is not whether it was an airplane. It is that a simple ancient object can inspire modern engineers to test its possibilities. The past and present meet through experimentation. The same thing happens with ancient surgical knowledge. More than 2,000 years ago, Indian physician Sushruta described medical procedures in remarkable detail. His writings discuss surgical techniques, instruments, medicinal substances, and reconstructive procedures. One famous example is rhinoplasty, a technique involving skin from the forehead to reconstruct a damaged nose was practiced in India long before modern plastic surgery. Centuries later, European physicians encountered similar techniques and began documenting them. Today, reconstructive surgery uses sophisticated modern equipment. But the basic principle of using living tissue to rebuild damaged anatomy is far older. This is a perfect reminder that ancient technology is not always made of gears and metal. Sometimes technology is knowledge, a procedure, a technique, a method passed from one generation to another. And knowledge can survive without machines. It can also disappear without leaving physical evidence. Ancient mathematics provides another example. The concept of zero-transformed mathematics. Without a reliable system for representing nothing as a number, modern mathematics would be radically different. The development of zero as both a placeholder and a number emerged through a long process across several cultures, with crucial advances in ancient India. This may sound less exciting than a 1,000-ton stone, but in terms of technological consequences, it may be far more important. Modern computers depend on binary logic. Engineering depends on mathematics. Physics depends on mathematics. Modern civilization depends on mathematical systems built over thousands of years. A small symbol carved into stone can therefore have a greater impact on history than a gigantic monument. And ancient Indian civilization produced another achievement that demonstrates just how sophisticated practical knowledge could become. Standardized measurements. Archaeological evidence from the Indus Valley Civilization reveals remarkably consistent systems of weights and measurements. Standardization is easy to take for granted today. We buy a kilogram of rice. We measure a meter of material. We use standardized dimensions in construction. But imagine trying to run a major city without common measurements. Trade would become chaotic. Construction would become difficult. Taxes would be difficult to calculate. Markets would be unreliable. Standardization requires administration. It requires trust. And it requires mathematical understanding. The cities of the Indus Valley demonstrate that large urban societies were capable of organizing these systems thousands of years ago. Their achievements are particularly fascinating because the civilization's writing system remains largely undeciphered. We know they existed. We know they built cities. We know they traded over enormous distances. We know they used standardized weights. But we still cannot read most of what they wrote. Imagine discovering a modern civilization while being unable to read its language. You could examine its buildings. You could study its machines. You could reconstruct its roads. But you would miss its explanations. That is exactly the challenge facing archaeologists studying the Indus Valley. The civilization left behind physical evidence, but its voice remains largely silent. And then there is another ancient technology that is so ordinary today that we rarely think about its origins. Plumbing. At ancient sites across the world, archaeologists have discovered drainage systems, toilets, wells, channels, and carefully engineered water systems. At the Palace of Knossos on Crete, ancient builders created sophisticated water management systems. The Indus Valley cities went even further. Urban drainage was integrated into city planning. Households could connect to drainage channels. Wastewater was managed through carefully constructed systems. These achievements remind us that technological sophistication is not always obvious. A civilization does not need computers to be technologically advanced. It can be advanced in sanitation, agriculture, architecture, hydraulics, metallurgy, navigation, astronomy, or medicine. The ancient world was not a single technological level. It was a collection of civilizations experimenting in different directions. Some discoveries were shared. Others remained local. Some survived. Others disappeared. And that creates one of the biggest mysteries of all. Why do some technologies survive while others vanish? Sometimes the answer is obvious. A useful invention spreads. A less useful one disappears. But history is often shaped by accidents. A war destroys a workshop. A trade route collapses. A city is abandoned. A political system disappears. A language dies. A natural disaster buries an entire settlement. Suddenly, knowledge that took centuries to develop can disappear within a single generation. This may have happened with ancient mechanical technology. The Antikythera mechanism proves that complex geared devices existed in the ancient Mediterranean. But why did this technology not develop continuously into industrial machinery? Why did Europe wait more than 1,000 years for comparable geared astronomical devices? Perhaps the knowledge existed elsewhere. Perhaps it was rare. Perhaps the mechanism was a unique creation. Perhaps other examples were destroyed. Or perhaps technological development requires more than a clever invention. It requires an ecosystem. You need skilled workers, materials, workshops, trade networks, economic demand, education, institutions, and political stability. Remove enough of these elements and even extraordinary technology can disappear. This is why the fall of ancient civilizations matters so much. When a civilization collapses, we often imagine buildings being destroyed. But the more important loss may be invisible. Teachers disappear. Craft traditions break. Engineers migrate. Libraries burn. Apprentices lose their masters. Manufacturing networks collapse. The technology does not necessarily vanish in one dramatic moment. It slowly becomes impossible to reproduce. That may be what happened to many ancient techniques. And this brings us back to the central mystery. Were ancient people capable of technologies far beyond what we imagine? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that ancient civilizations repeatedly achieved things modern observers once considered impossible. No, in the sense that there is no reliable evidence that ancient civilizations possessed smartphones, aircraft, nuclear weapons, or other modern technologies thousands of years before their time. The truth is more complicated. Ancient people were capable of astonishing engineering using materials and methods available to them. They could calculate. They could experiment. They could observe. They could organize thousands of workers. They could preserve knowledge for generations. And sometimes, they could invent something so sophisticated that modern researchers still debate how it worked. That is not evidence that they were primitive. It is evidence that our definition of technological progress is too narrow. Technology is not only electricity. Technology is the ability to transform knowledge into practical results. By that definition, ancient humans were technological innovators. They engineered landscapes. They controlled water. They transformed metals. They developed medicine. They created complex mathematical systems. They navigated oceans. They built monumental structures. They designed machines. And they left behind clues that still challenge us. Perhaps one day, an excavation will reveal another machine like the Antikythera mechanism. Perhaps archaeologists will uncover an ancient workshop filled with tools that explain how enormous stones were moved. Perhaps a forgotten manuscript will finally reveal the purpose of the Roman dodecahedrons. Or perhaps we will discover that some of today's greatest mysteries were caused by something much simpler. We misunderstood the evidence. That possibility is just as exciting. Because archaeology is not about proving the most dramatic story. It is about getting closer to what actually happened. And every time new evidence appears, the story can change. The ancient world is not finished speaking. It is simply speaking very quietly, under layers of soil, inside forgotten tombs, beneath collapsed cities, at the bottom of oceans, and sometimes inside objects that look completely ordinary. The next discovery could be waiting anywhere. A piece of metal, a broken stone, a forgotten manuscript, a buried machine, something that has survived thousands of years while the people who created it disappeared completely. And when that object is finally uncovered, we may discover something far more unsettling than proof of impossible technology. We may discover that the ancient world knew far more than we ever gave it credit for, and that some of the greatest inventions in human history may have already been created once before, only to be forgotten. There are discoveries that challenge what we know about the ancient world, and then there are discoveries that seem to challenge the very timeline of human civilization. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that ancient people possessed machines from the future. Perhaps it is that we have underestimated them completely. For centuries, historians imagined the ancient world as a place of simple tools, primitive transportation, and limited scientific knowledge. Stone, wood, copper, fire, and human muscle were considered the foundations of ancient engineering. Yet scattered across the planet are objects and structures that force us to ask a difficult question. How much did ancient people really know? Consider the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera, this strange bronze device was built more than 2,000 years ago. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a corroded collection of metal fragments. But hidden inside were gears arranged with astonishing complexity. When researchers reconstructed the mechanism, they discovered something extraordinary. It could model the movements of celestial bodies, track lunar cycles, predict eclipses, and organize astronomical events with remarkable precision. Imagine standing in ancient Greece more than 1,000 years before the first mechanical clocks appeared in Europe and opening a small wooden box containing a machine capable of calculating the movements of the heavens. To the people who built it, this may not have seemed impossible. It may have been knowledge passed from one generation of engineers to another. And that possibility changes everything. Because the Antikythera mechanism may not have been a unique invention. It could have been the surviving fragment of a much larger technological tradition that has almost completely disappeared. Ancient civilizations rarely preserved technical manuals. Machines broke. Metal corroded. Wooden components rotted. Workshops disappeared beneath later buildings. Entire cities were destroyed by earthquakes, wars, floods, and time. What remains are only fragments. And sometimes those fragments are almost impossible to interpret. In Egypt, for example, the Disk of Sabu has fascinated researchers for decades. It was discovered inside the tomb of a high-ranking Egyptian official and dates back thousands of years. Made from fragile schist, the object has a thin central hub surrounded by 3 curved lobes. It does not look like an ordinary bowl. It does not look like a plate. And it certainly does not look like something you would expect to find in a burial chamber from such an ancient period. Some researchers believe it was ceremonial. Others have proposed that its unusual shape could have served a practical mechanical purpose. Experiments with replicas have even suggested that its geometry could produce a vortex when rotated. But does that mean the ancient Egyptians were building pumps? Not necessarily. This is where the mystery becomes more interesting. An artifact can demonstrate that an ancient craftsman possessed a particular skill without revealing exactly why that skill was used. The Disk of Sabu may have been an imitation of something made from another material. It may have served a symbolic function. It may have been part of an unknown device. Or perhaps its true purpose has simply been lost. The problem is that archaeology deals with evidence, not possibilities. And when the evidence is incomplete, imagination rushes in to fill the gaps. That is exactly what happened with another famous object, the so-called Baghdad Battery. Discovered in Iraq, the artifact consists of a clay vessel containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with an acidic liquid, experiments demonstrated that a small electrical potential could be produced. That sounds astonishing. A battery, supposedly 2,000 years old. But there is a major problem. We have no ancient text clearly explaining that the object was intended to generate electricity. No instruction manual. No diagram. No ancient description saying, this device produces electrical current. So the battery theory remains fascinating, but uncertain. Perhaps it was capable of producing electricity accidentally. Perhaps it was used for another purpose entirely. And that distinction matters, because mystery does not automatically mean advanced technology. Sometimes the real mystery is simply that we no longer understand the ordinary purpose of an ancient object. But then there are artifacts that appear to have capabilities that are difficult to dismiss. Take the Lycurgus cup. This ancient Roman glass vessel looks green when illuminated from one direction and red when illuminated from another. For centuries, no one understood how its color-changing effect worked. Modern microscopic analysis revealed something remarkable. Tiny particles of gold and silver had been incorporated into the glass. The particles were so small that they interacted with light at the nanoscale. In other words, an ancient craftsman had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, created a form of nanotechnology. The word nanotechnology sounds futuristic, but the phenomenon itself is ancient. The makers of the cup did not have electron microscopes. They did not understand modern physics. They did not possess the terminology we use today. Yet somehow, they produced a material with properties that modern scientists could only fully explain centuries later. This is perhaps the most important lesson. Technology does not always require modern scientific understanding. A person can discover a useful process through experimentation long before understanding why it works. Ancient craftsmen may have learned through generations of trial and error. They may have known exactly which minerals to mix, which temperatures to use, which metals to combine, and which techniques produced the desired result. The knowledge could have been practical rather than theoretical. And that knowledge could disappear. Imagine an ancient workshop. A master craftsman dies. His apprentices scatter. His workshop burns. His tools disappear. His secrets are never written down. A technique that took generations to develop could vanish in a single lifetime. Thousands of years later, archaeologists discover the final product. They see the result, but not the process. And without the process, the artifact looks impossible. This may explain some of the mysteries surrounding ancient construction. Baalbek is one of the most spectacular examples. Massive limestone blocks weighing hundreds of tons were incorporated into the foundations of the monumental complex. Some individual stones are so enormous that they challenge our intuition about ancient transportation. How did workers move them? How did they position them? How did they lift or slide them into place with the technology available at the time? The usual explanations involve ramps, rollers, sledges, ropes, levers, manpower, and carefully coordinated engineering. None of these ideas requires futuristic machines. But the scale of the project remains astonishing. And perhaps that is the real mystery. We often imagine ancient people as incapable of extraordinary engineering because they lacked modern machines. But machines are not the only source of technological power. Organization is technology. Mathematics is technology. Materials knowledge is technology. Human coordination is technology. A civilization capable of organizing thousands of workers, feeding them, housing them, training specialized craftsmen, transporting materials, and maintaining a massive construction project possesses a form of technological power that is easy to overlook. The same principle can be seen at places like Pumapunku. The enormous stone blocks, precise surfaces, unusual angles, and high-altitude location have inspired countless theories about lost technology. Some claims suggest machines that sound more like modern construction equipment. Others suggest extraterrestrial intervention. But there is a simpler possibility. Ancient builders may simply have been extremely skilled. That does not make the achievement less impressive. In fact, it may make it more impressive. Because if human beings achieved these results without cranes, engines, computers, or electricity, then the real story is not that they possessed technology from another world. The real story is that they accomplished something we once assumed they could not. And that forces us to reconsider the word primitive. Perhaps it is one of the most misleading words in archaeology. A civilization can lack modern electronics while possessing extraordinary knowledge of astronomy. It can lack engines while mastering hydraulic engineering. It can lack microscopes while producing materials with nanoscale properties. It can lack computers while creating mechanical astronomical calculators. Ancient technology did not necessarily follow the same path as ours. And that means we should be careful when we look at mysterious artifacts. An object that seems impossible may not prove that history is wrong. It may prove that history is incomplete. But there is another possibility. Sometimes the mystery is created not by ancient technology, but by modern misunderstanding. The Khoso artifact is a perfect example. For years, it was presented as evidence of an object trapped inside a geological formation hundreds of thousands of years old. Some believed it was an ancient machine. Others imagined a device left behind by an advanced civilization. Some even connected it to extraterrestrials or time travelers. The mystery seemed enormous, until investigators examined it more carefully. The object turned out to be a spark plug, a relatively modern industrial component surrounded by a natural concretion. The supposed evidence of impossible technology collapsed. And this is why skepticism is essential. If every mysterious object is automatically treated as evidence of lost civilizations, we stop investigating and start believing. The truth is often stranger than the theory. Sometimes the ancient mystery is real. Sometimes the artifact is misunderstood. Sometimes it is a hoax. And sometimes the answer is simply waiting for better evidence. But what happens when evidence itself disappears? That may be the greatest mystery of all. Ancient knowledge could have existed in countless forms that left almost no physical trace. Maybe they are still buried. Or maybe the Antikythera mechanism was the surviving masterpiece of a technological tradition that disappeared long before modern history began recording it. The same uncertainty surrounds the Lycurgus cup. Ancient craftsmen created glass containing microscopic particles of precious metals that produced a dramatic optical effect. They may not have understood modern nanoscience, but they knew how to make the material behave in a remarkable way. That distinction is crucial. Technology does not always begin with theory. Sometimes technology begins with observation. A craftsman discovers that one mixture behaves differently from another. He repeats the process. His apprentice learns it. The next generation improves it. Eventually, an entire tradition develops. But if the tradition disappears, the final artifact remains without an explanation. Thousands of years later, someone finds it and asks, how did they do this? Perhaps the answer is not impossible technology. Perhaps it is forgotten technology. And forgotten technology may be far more common than we realize. Think about the ancient knowledge that has already vanished. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of lost information. But the destruction of libraries was not the only way knowledge disappeared. Civilizations collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Languages died. Craft traditions ended. Wars destroyed workshops. Floods buried settlements. Earthquakes shattered buildings. And sometimes, knowledge simply stopped being passed from one person to another. Imagine a technology requiring 50 years of apprenticeship. If the final master dies without a student capable of continuing the tradition, the technology is gone, not destroyed, forgotten. That distinction could explain why certain ancient achievements appear isolated. A civilization may have developed a brilliant solution to a problem, used it for generations, and then lost it forever. The modern world has experienced similar events. There are techniques once used by ancient and medieval craftsmen that researchers still struggle to reproduce perfectly. So why should we assume every ancient mystery must have an extraordinary explanation? We shouldn't. Some mysteries have ordinary answers. The Khoso artifact appeared to be evidence of impossible technology until investigators identified it as a relatively modern spark plug. The London hammer seemed to suggest humans existed alongside dinosaurs until geological processes provided a much simpler explanation. The so-called Dropa stones became part of an extraterrestrial legend despite the lack of reliable archaeological evidence. The Piri Reis map inspired theories about ancient knowledge of Antarctica, but careful analysis produced far less sensational conclusions. And the Yonaguni underwater formation has been described as the ruins of a lost civilization, while many geologists argue that natural geological processes can explain its appearance. These stories teach us something important. A strange object is not automatically an impossible object. A mysterious structure is not automatically evidence of a lost civilization. And an unexplained artifact is not proof of extraterrestrials. But skepticism should not become another form of blindness. Because sometimes the evidence really is extraordinary. Baalbek is extraordinary. The Antikythera mechanism is extraordinary. The Lycurgus cup is extraordinary. The precision of ancient Egyptian construction is extraordinary. The engineering of ancient hydraulic systems is extraordinary. The Indus Valley civilization's standardized measurements and urban planning are extraordinary. Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary. The ancient saddle discovered in the deserts of China is extraordinary. The preservation of the Nazca and Chinchorro remains is extraordinary. The terracotta army is extraordinary. And the sheer scale of ancient human achievement is extraordinary. We do not need aliens to make the past fascinating. We do not need time travelers. We do not need a forgotten super civilization with machines more advanced than ours. Maybe they are still buried. Or maybe the Antikythera mechanism was the surviving masterpiece of a technological tradition that disappeared long before modern history began recording it. The same uncertainty surrounds the Lycurgus cup. Ancient craftsmen created glass containing microscopic particles of precious metals that produced a dramatic optical effect. They may not have understood modern nanoscience, but they knew how to make the material behave in a remarkable way. That distinction is crucial. Technology does not always begin with theory. Sometimes technology begins with observation. A craftsman discovers that one mixture behaves differently from another. He repeats the process. His apprentice learns it. The next generation improves it. Eventually, an entire tradition develops. But if the tradition disappears, the final artifact remains without an explanation. Thousands of years later, someone finds it and asks, "How did they do this?" Perhaps the answer is not impossible technology. Perhaps it is forgotten technology. And forgotten technology may be far more common than we realize. Think about the ancient knowledge that has already vanished. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of lost information. But the destruction of libraries was not the only way knowledge disappeared. Civilizations collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Languages died. Craft traditions ended. Wars destroyed workshops. Floods buried settlements. Earthquakes shattered buildings. And sometimes, knowledge simply stopped being passed from one person to another. Imagine a technology requiring 50 years of apprenticeship. If the final master dies without a student capable of continuing the tradition, the technology is gone, not destroyed, forgotten. That distinction could explain why certain ancient achievements appear isolated. A civilization may have developed a brilliant solution to a problem, used it for generations, and then lost it forever. The modern world has experienced similar events. There are techniques once used by ancient and medieval craftsmen that researchers still struggle to reproduce perfectly. So why should we assume every ancient mystery must have an extraordinary explanation? We shouldn't. Some mysteries have ordinary answers. The Khoso artifact appeared to be evidence of impossible technology until investigators identified it as a relatively modern spark plug. The London hammer seemed to suggest humans existed alongside dinosaurs until geological processes provided a much simpler explanation. The so-called Dropa stones became part of an extraterrestrial legend despite the lack of reliable archaeological evidence. The Piri Reis map inspired theories about ancient knowledge of Antarctica, but careful analysis produced far less sensational conclusions. And the Yonaguni underwater formation has been described as the ruins of a lost civilization, while many geologists argue that natural geological processes can explain its appearance. These stories teach us something important. A strange object is not automatically an impossible object. A mysterious structure is not automatically evidence of a lost civilization. And an unexplained artifact is not proof of extraterrestrials. But skepticism should not become another form of blindness. Because sometimes the evidence really is extraordinary. Baalbek is extraordinary. The Antikythera mechanism is extraordinary. The Lycurgus cup is extraordinary. The precision of ancient Egyptian construction is extraordinary. The engineering of ancient hydraulic systems is extraordinary. The Indus Valley civilization's standardized measurements and urban planning are extraordinary. Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary. The ancient saddle discovered in the deserts of China is extraordinary. The preservation of the Nazca and Chinchorro remains is extraordinary. The terracotta army is extraordinary. And the sheer scale of ancient human achievement is extraordinary. We do not need aliens to make the past fascinating. We do not need time travelers. We do not need a forgotten super-civilization with machines more advanced than ours. Human beings were already capable of astonishing things. And perhaps that is the part of history we have underestimated the most. We tend to compare ancient people with ourselves. They had no electricity. We have electricity. They had no computers. We have computers. They had no modern cranes. We have cranes. Therefore, we assume they were technologically inferior. But technology is not a single ladder. It is a network of different solutions. An ancient civilization could be incredibly advanced in stoneworking while having no knowledge of electricity. It could understand astronomy without understanding modern physics. It could create sophisticated surgery without knowing the existence of bacteria. It could develop precise mathematics without having a computer. It could move enormous stones through organization, geometry, physics, and human labor. The ancient world was not a primitive version of the modern world. It was another world. And that realization changes how we should interpret every mysterious discovery. When we find a strange artifact, the first question should not be, who gave them this technology? The better question is, what did they know that we have forgotten? That question opens a completely different door. Imagine archaeologists excavating a forgotten settlement thousands of years from now. They find an old smartphone. They have no electricity. They have no semiconductor factories. They have never seen a touchscreen. They cannot turn the device on. What would they think? A sacred object? A ceremonial tablet? A miniature mirror? A mysterious black stone? Perhaps they would invent theories about it. They might argue that it was used for religious rituals. Someone might suggest that it was a symbol of royal authority. Another researcher might claim it was a decorative object. And someone else might insist that no ancient civilization could possibly have created something so advanced. They would be wrong. But they would have one problem. They would be missing the context. They would not know what a smartphone was. They would have the object, but not the civilization that created it. That is exactly the problem archaeologists face today. We have fragments, but we rarely have the complete story. A mysterious object becomes truly understandable only when we find its context. Who owned it? Where was it found? What was around it? What tools were nearby? What materials were available? What did the people who created it believe? How was it used? And most importantly, what else existed alongside it? This is why future discoveries matter so much. A single object can remain mysterious for centuries. Then one new excavation can reveal the missing piece. Suddenly, the impossible becomes understandable. The strange becomes ordinary. Or sometimes, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Imagine finding an ancient workshop containing dozens of unfinished versions of the same mysterious machine. Suddenly, the object is no longer an isolated curiosity. It becomes evidence of a technology. Imagine discovering an ancient manuscript explaining exactly how the machine worked. The mystery disappears. But something much more valuable takes its place: knowledge. Now, imagine discovering something else. A device that cannot be explained by any known technology from its time. A device found in a perfectly dated archaeological layer, surrounded by tools and materials belonging to the same civilization, with no evidence of modern contamination, with manufacturing techniques that cannot be reproduced using the technology available at the time. That would be different. That would be revolutionary. Because at that point, the question would no longer be whether history books are wrong. The question would be, what have we been missing? And perhaps that discovery is already out there. buried beneath a desert, locked inside an unopened tomb, hidden beneath the jungle, covered by centuries of sediment, resting beneath the ocean, or sitting inside a museum collection mislabeled for decades. There are millions of archaeological objects in museums around the world. Some have never been thoroughly examined using modern technology. New imaging techniques can reveal details invisible to the human eye. Chemical analysis can identify materials that ancient researchers could not recognize. Artificial intelligence can compare patterns across enormous archaeological databases. Satellite imaging can reveal structures buried beneath deserts. LiDAR can expose ancient roads and settlements hidden beneath forests. Ground-penetrating technology can reveal what lies underground without destroying the site. The future of archaeology may therefore be more mysterious than the past. Because we are entering an era when technology can search places that humans cannot easily reach. And every new tool creates the possibility of discovering something that changes the story. But there is another reason this matters. Ancient mysteries are not just about stones, artifacts, and ruins. They are about us. Every mysterious object represents a human being who once stood somewhere on this planet. Someone had an idea. Someone picked up a tool. Someone shaped a piece of stone. Someone mixed metals. Someone watched the stars. Someone looked at a problem and thought, there must be another way. That person is gone. Their civilization may be gone. Their language may be gone. Their name may be gone. But their idea survived. Perhaps that is the true miracle of archaeology. Not discovering ancient technology, but discovering evidence that human curiosity has always existed. Long before computers, long before rockets, long before modern laboratories. People looked at the world and wanted to understand it. They wanted to measure it, control it, build it, explore it. And sometimes they succeeded in ways that still surprise us. So when you look at the massive stones of Baalbek, the gears of the Antikythera mechanism, the strange geometry of ancient artifacts, the mysterious chambers beneath forgotten cities, or the thousands of objects whose original purpose has vanished. Don't immediately ask whether aliens built them. Ask something more powerful. What were human beings capable of? Because the answer may be far more extraordinary. Maybe the greatest lost technology was not a machine. Maybe it was knowledge. Knowledge of materials. Knowledge of mathematics. Knowledge of engineering. Knowledge of medicine. Knowledge of astronomy. Knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation until one day, the chain was broken. And when the chain broke, the technology disappeared with it. Only the artifact remained. A silent message from someone who lived thousands of years ago. A message saying, "We were here. We built this. We understood something. But we forgot to tell you how." And perhaps that is why these mysteries continue to haunt us. Because every unexplained artifact is a reminder that civilization is not a straight line. Knowledge can rise. Knowledge can disappear. Civilizations can flourish. Civilizations can collapse. And history can forget. The past may not be a story of primitive humans slowly becoming intelligent. It may be a story of countless generations of intelligent humans solving problems in different ways. Some of their solutions survived. Others vanished. And some are waiting to be discovered again. So the next time someone tells you that ancient people were incapable of extraordinary technology, remember the evidence. Remember the machines. Remember the monuments. Remember the impossible stones. Remember the forgotten workshops. Remember the artifacts that once seemed too strange to be real. And remember that mystery does not always mean aliens. Sometimes, mystery means we haven't found the answer yet. Perhaps somewhere beneath the ground, another discovery is waiting. Another mechanism. Another forgotten workshop. another ancient manuscript, another object that will force us to look at history differently. And when that day comes, the most important question will not be whether ancient technology was impossible. It will be whether our understanding of the past was ever complete. Because history is not finished. It is still being uncovered, stone by stone, artifact by artifact, buried secret by buried secret. And perhaps the greatest discovery of all is not waiting somewhere in the future. It is waiting beneath the past. And when we finally uncover it, we may discover that the ancient world was never as primitive as we imagined. The real mystery was not how they built the impossible. The real mystery is how much they knew before we forgot.